A quiet pattern rests beneath the events of the wizarding world, one that becomes clearer when the pace is allowed to slow. It is formed through choices made in uncertainty, through messages delayed, and through moments where understanding arrives slightly too late. Some outcomes appear fixed when remembered quickly, but they shift when held in stillness and examined with care. Paths begin to appear that were almost taken, and protections that nearly held. In this account, each moment is approached gently, not to assign fault, but to observe how differently certain endings might have unfolded with only small changes. In the wizarding world, the idea of a preventable loss does not always present itself in a direct or obvious way. Magic, by its nature, creates the impression that harm can be reversed, delayed, or even avoided entirely if the right knowledge or skill is applied at the right moment. Healing spells can close wounds, potions can restore strength, and protective charms can hold danger at a distance. Instead, they shift it into quieter places, where outcomes depend on timing, awareness, and the limits of what is understood in a given moment. A loss becomes preventable not because it could have been stopped with certainty, but because there existed a point at which a different decision might have altered its course. This point is often small. It may be a conversation that did not take place, a warning that was not recognized, or a hesitation that lasted only a few seconds longer than it needed to. When viewed from a distance, these moments seem minor, almost indistinct. When examined more closely, they begin to take on a clearer shape, revealing how closely events are tied to one another. Magic introduces additional layers to this process. Certain forms of protection, such as enchantments placed on locations or objects, rely on precise conditions. If those conditions are not fully understood, or if they are applied with incomplete information, the protection may hold only partially. In some cases, it creates a sense of security that leads to less caution rather than more. This pattern appears repeatedly, where confidence in a spell or system reduces the likelihood of noticing its limitations. The result is not immediate failure, but a gradual weakening of awareness that becomes significant over time. There are also forms of magic that suggest a fixed outcome. Prophecies, for example, are often interpreted as statements of inevitability. However, their meaning depends on how they are understood and acted upon. A prophecy does not enforce an outcome on its own. It exists as a piece of information, one that influences behavior. When individuals respond to it, they begin to shape the conditions that bring it closer to reality. In this way, what appears to be unavoidable is often the result of repeated choices made under the belief that it cannot be changed. Institutions within the wizarding world also play a role in shaping preventable outcomes. The Ministry of Magic, Hogwarts, and other established systems are designed to provide structure and safety. They create rules, offer guidance, and attempt to manage risk. Delays in communication, incomplete records, and shifting priorities can leave gaps where important information does not reach those who need it. In these gaps, decisions are made without full context, increasing the likelihood that a harmful situation will develop unnoticed until it becomes difficult to reverse. Another factor is the distribution of knowledge. Not all witches and wizards have access to the same information or training. Some understand advanced forms of magic, while others rely on more basic skills. This difference does not always appear significant in ordinary circumstances, but it becomes more noticeable in moments of crisis. A person who lacks certain knowledge may not recognize a threat until it is already present. By the time it is understood, the opportunity to prevent it may have already passed. Time itself moves differently in moments of danger. What feels like a brief pause can carry weight, especially when a response is required quickly. A delay of even a few seconds can allow a situation to shift beyond control. This is not always due to a lack of ability, but rather to the complexity of what is happening. Multiple factors may need to be considered at once, and the correct response may not be immediately clear. In these moments, the line between preventable and unavoidable becomes difficult to define. There is also the influence of emotion. Fear, loyalty, hesitation, and uncertainty all affect how decisions are made. A person may act quickly in one situation and slowly in another, depending on what they perceive and how they interpret it. These responses are not always predictable, and they do not always align with what might be considered the most effective course of action. Over time, these small variations in response accumulate, shaping the overall outcome in ways that are not immediately visible. When multiple individuals are involved, their decisions begin to overlap. One person's action can create a new set of conditions for another. If communication between them is limited, these actions may not align. Each person acts based on their own understanding, which may differ from what others know. This creates a sequence of events that moves forward without a single, unified direction. Within this sequence, opportunities for prevention may appear, but they are not always recognized by those who encounter them. The concept of preventability, then, is not fixed. It changes depending on perspective. When looking back at an event, it is possible to trace the points where a different choice might have led to a different result. These points become clearer with distance, as the full sequence of events is known. In the moment, however, these points are less distinct. They are part of a larger flow of information and action, where each decision is made without complete certainty. This does not mean that outcomes are random. Patterns can still be observed. Certain types of situations tend to produce similar results, especially when the same conditions are present. A lack of communication, combined with overconfidence in protection, often leads to delayed responses. Limited knowledge, combined with urgency, often leads to misinterpretation. These patterns repeat across different events, creating a consistent structure beneath the surface of the story. By examining these patterns slowly, it becomes possible to see how preventable outcomes are formed. They do not arise from a single failure, but from a series of small moments that connect over time. Each moment, on its own, may seem unimportant. Together, they create a path that leads toward a particular ending. If even one of these moments had unfolded differently, the path itself might have shifted, leading somewhere else. In the context of the wizarding world, this understanding does not change what has already happened. It does not alter the sequence of events or the outcomes that followed. Instead, it provides a way to observe those events with greater clarity. By slowing down and focusing on the details, the structure of each situation becomes more visible. The points of change, though small, can be seen more clearly, offering a different way of understanding how each loss came to be. Through this approach, the idea of preventability remains quiet and steady. It does not seek to assign responsibility or to revisit events with urgency. It simply traces the lines that connect one moment to the next, allowing them to settle into place. In doing so, it reveals how closely each outcome is tied to the conditions that preceded it, and how even the smallest variations within those conditions can shape the direction of what follows. During the years of the First Wizarding War, the structure that was meant to provide stability began to change in subtle ways. The Ministry of Magic continued to operate, issuing guidance and maintaining the appearance of control, but its responses often arrived after events had already taken shape. Information moved slowly, sometimes held back by uncertainty, sometimes by fear of causing wider concern. In this environment, decisions were made with partial awareness, and actions were taken without a complete understanding of what was already unfolding. Voldemort's rise did not occur all at once. It developed gradually, through quiet recruitment and carefully chosen displays of power. At first, these actions appeared isolated, a disappearance in one place, an unexplained event in another. Without a clear pattern, it was possible to interpret each incident separately. This made it more difficult to recognize the scale of what was forming. By the time the connections became more visible, the network behind them had already grown more established. The ministry's approach relied on confirmation before action. Reports needed to be verified, and threats needed to be defined clearly before resources were committed. This process created a delay between the moment a problem emerged and the moment it was addressed. In some cases, this delay allowed situations to develop beyond the point where simple intervention would have been effective. What might have been contained early instead required a more complex response later, when fewer options remained. Fear also shaped how information was shared. Many families became cautious in their communication, choosing to speak less openly about what they observed. Rumors circulated quietly, often without being reported through official channels. This created a separation between what was known privately and what was recognized publicly. Without a complete picture, the ministry's understanding remained limited, and its actions reflected that limitation. Within communities, trust began to shift. It became less certain who could be relied upon, and this uncertainty influenced behavior. People hesitated before sharing information, unsure of how it might be received or who it might reach. In some cases, this hesitation led to silence, even when a warning might have been useful. These small decisions, made individually, combined to create a broader pattern where knowledge existed but was not always used. The Order of the Phoenix formed as a response to this environment, operating outside the ministry's structure. Its members gathered information and acted where they believed intervention was needed. However, they also faced limitations. Their knowledge was not complete, and their actions were often constrained by the need to remain hidden. This meant that even when they recognized a developing threat, their ability to respond fully was not always possible. The use of secrecy, while necessary for protection, introduced its own challenges. This reduced the risk of exposure, but also limited the number of people who could recognize a problem as it developed. If a situation changed quickly, those without access to that information might act without realizing the full context. In this way, secrecy both protected and isolated, shaping outcomes in ways that were not always intended. At the same time, Voldemort's followers operated with a different structure. Their actions were coordinated through direct control, and their objectives were often carried out without hesitation. This created a contrast between two systems, one that relied on careful verification and one that moved with immediate intent. The difference in pace influenced how events unfolded. Situations that required a quick response were sometimes met with delay, allowing them to progress further before resistance could form. There were moments when intervention came close to preventing harm. A warning might reach someone just before an event, or a protective measure might hold long enough to allow escape. These moments often depended on precise timing. If a message had been delivered slightly earlier, or if a decision had been made with greater certainty, the outcome might have shifted. The presence of these near interventions suggests that the boundary between prevention and loss was often narrow. The ministry's internal structure also contributed to its limitations. Different departments handled separate aspects of magical life, and communication between them was not always immediate. Information that might have been useful in one area could remain within another, not reaching those who needed it in time. This separation created gaps where important details were not connected, reducing the overall effectiveness of the response. In addition, there was a tendency to rely on established procedures. These procedures were designed for stability, not for rapidly changing conditions. When faced with a situation that did not follow expected patterns, the response could become uncertain. Time was spent determining the correct course of action, during which events continued to move forward. By the time a decision was reached, the situation had often changed. Individual actions within this system also played a role. Some chose to resist quietly, offering help where they could without drawing attention. Others withdrew, focusing on their own safety and avoiding involvement. Each of these choices influenced the broader environment, shaping how information moved and how support was provided. While these decisions were often made with care, they contributed to a landscape where coordinated action was more difficult to achieve. The concept of preventable loss becomes clearer when these elements are considered together. No single failure defines the outcome. Instead, it is the combination of delays, uncertainties, and limited communication that creates the conditions in which harm occurs. Each part of the system functions as intended in isolation, but when combined, they produce gaps that are not immediately visible. As the war continued, these patterns became more pronounced. The distance between awareness and action remained, and the flow of information continued to be uneven. Opportunities for prevention existed, but they were often dispersed across different parts of the system, not aligning in a way that allowed them to be used effectively. This misalignment meant that even when the necessary elements for prevention were present, they did not always come together at the right time. Looking back at this period, it becomes possible to trace the points where different decisions might have led to different outcomes. A report delivered sooner, a warning taken more seriously, or a response made with greater urgency could have altered the course of certain events. These possibilities do not change what occurred, but they reveal how closely those outcomes were tied to the conditions that preceded them. In this way, the First Wizarding War can be seen not only as a series of conflicts, but as a system in motion, where each part influenced the others. The losses that occurred within it were shaped by this system, emerging from the interactions between individuals, institutions, and the flow of information. By observing these interactions carefully, the presence of preventable moments becomes more visible, showing how small changes within the system might have led to a different path. The protection placed around the Potters was built on a form of magic that required trust to function completely. The Fidelius charm concealed the location of their home within the knowledge of a single person, known as the Secret Keeper. As long as that person remained loyal and silent, the secret could not be discovered through ordinary means. Even those standing close to the house would not perceive it without being told. This created a sense of certainty, a belief that the protection, once established, would hold without exception. James and Lily Potter did not choose this protection lightly. By that time, the threat against them had already taken shape. Voldemort had begun to act with greater focus, and the possibility that he would seek them out had become more immediate. The decision to use the Fidelius charm suggested an understanding of that danger. It was not a passive measure, but an intentional step taken to create distance between themselves and what was approaching. Within this decision, there was another choice that carried equal weight. The identity of the Secret Keeper would determine the strength of the protection in practice. Sirius Black was first considered, a close friend whose loyalty appeared steady and direct. His role within their lives had been consistent, and there was little reason, at that moment, to question it. However, the decision shifted. Instead of placing the secret with Sirius, it was given to Peter Pettigrew. This change was not made without thought. It was based on the assumption that Pettigrew would be less obvious as a target. If Sirius was known to be close to the Potters, it might be expected that he would hold the secret. By choosing someone less prominent, the hope was to create a layer of misdirection. The protection would not only rely on concealment, but also on the expectation that others might look in the wrong place. At the time, this reasoning carried a certain logic. It accounted for how others might interpret the situation, and it attempted to use that interpretation as an additional form of defense. Yet it also introduced a different kind of risk, one that was less visible. The strength of the Fidelius charm depended entirely on the reliability of a single individual. If that reliability was uncertain, even slightly, the entire structure of protection became unstable. Peter Pettigrew's position within the group had always been quieter. He followed more than he led, and his presence was often defined by the actions of those around him. This made him less noticeable, which may have contributed to the belief that he would not draw attention. At the same time, it meant that his internal state was less clearly understood. His fears, his doubts, and his capacity to withstand pressure were not as visible as his outward behavior. The decision to entrust him with the secret placed him in a position of significant importance. It required him to hold information that could not be shared, even under threat. In the context of the war, where coercion and fear were common, this responsibility was not a simple one. It demanded a level of resilience that may not have been fully considered at the time the choice was made. There were opportunities, before the charm was enacted, where this decision might have been reconsidered. Conversations could have explored the implications more deeply, or alternative approaches might have been discussed. The charm itself did not require that it be performed in a single, fixed way. Different arrangements could have been made, or additional safeguards might have been introduced. These possibilities were present, though not fully pursued. Once the charm was in place, the sense of security it created began to settle. The Potters withdrew from view, relying on the belief that their location was no longer accessible. This withdrawal reduced their exposure to immediate danger, but it also limited their awareness of changes occurring beyond their home. Information about the movement of threats or the shifting conditions of the war would have reached them more slowly, filtered through the same system that had already shown signs of delay. At the same time, Pettigrew's situation changed. Holding the secret placed him under a different kind of pressure, one that was not shared by others. If he experienced fear or doubt, there were few avenues for addressing it. The nature of the charm required silence, and silence limited the possibility of seeking support. In this way, the protection that shielded the Potters also isolated the person responsible for maintaining it. The moment of betrayal did not occur in isolation. It was the result of conditions that had developed over time. Pettigrew's fear, combined with the influence of Voldemort's growing power, created a situation where the secret became a point of vulnerability rather than strength. Once it was revealed, the protection collapsed completely. There was no gradual weakening, only an immediate transition from concealment to exposure. When Voldemort arrived at the Potter's home, the sequence of events moved quickly. James attempted to respond without a wand, suggesting that the moment came without warning. Lily's presence in the house, along with Harry, placed them directly within the path of what followed. The protection that had seemed certain only moments before no longer existed, leaving them with little time to react. Looking back, the preventability of this outcome becomes tied to the earlier decisions that shaped it. The choice of Secret Keeper, the assumptions about visibility and loyalty, and the absence of additional safeguards all contributed to the conditions that allowed the betrayal to occur. Each of these elements, on its own, might not have led to the same result. Together, they formed a structure that depended on a single point of failure. There were also moments where the flow of information might have altered the situation. If signs of Pettigrew's uncertainty had been recognized, or if warnings about his vulnerability had reached the right people in time, the decision could have been revisited. Even after the charm was enacted, a shift in understanding might have prompted a change, though this would have required action under conditions of increasing risk. The protection itself, while powerful, was not absolute in the way it was often perceived. It functioned perfectly within its defined limits, but those limits were narrow. It did not account for the internal state of the Secret Keeper, nor did it provide a mechanism for adapting if that state changed. In this way, it relied on factors that extended beyond the magic itself, factors that were more difficult to control. The loss that followed is often remembered as a turning point, a moment that shaped everything that came after. When viewed slowly, it also reveals the presence of alternative paths that were close but not taken. A different choice of Secret Keeper, a deeper consideration of risk, or an earlier recognition of vulnerability might have led to a different outcome. These possibilities remain quiet, existing alongside the events as they occurred. By examining this sequence in detail, the nature of preventable loss becomes more defined. It is not a matter of certainty, but of proximity. The difference between what happened and what might have happened is often small, measured in decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. In the case of the Potters, Those decisions formed a path that led to a moment where protection almost held, but did not fully remain in place. Within the group that later became known as the Marauders, the balance between confidence and uncertainty was not always evenly shared. James Potter and Sirius Black often moved with a sense of ease, shaped by skill and certainty in their abilities. Remus Lupin carried a quieter awareness, shaped by caution and the need to manage a condition that required careful attention. Peter Pettigrew stood slightly apart from these patterns, not excluded, but less defined by a clear role. His presence was consistent, yet often shaped by the movement of the others, rather than by his own direction. This difference did not immediately suggest instability. Within a close group, variations in personality are common, and they can exist without creating conflict. Pettigrew's tendency to follow, rather than lead, may have appeared harmless, even supportive. He participated in their shared experiences, learned alongside them, and remained within the circle that they formed. Over time, this continuity may have created a sense of reliability that was based more on familiarity than on deeper understanding. At Hogwarts, much of their time was structured by routine. Classes, shared spaces, and repeated interactions created an environment where behavior could be observed regularly. Yet even within this structure, certain aspects of a person's inner state remain less visible. Fear, for example, does not always present itself openly. It can exist beneath outward behavior, shaping decisions in subtle ways that are not immediately recognized by others. Pettigrew's fear may have been present long before it became significant. In a setting where his closest companions often acted with confidence, his own responses may have been influenced by comparison. This does not necessarily lead to immediate change, but it can create a gradual shift in perception. Over time, the difference between his position and theirs may have become more pronounced in his own understanding, even if it was not openly discussed. There were moments where this difference might have been noticed. Hesitation in situations that required quick action, a tendency to defer decisions, or a reliance on others to lead could have been interpreted as signs of uncertainty. Within the group, however, these traits may have been absorbed into the broader dynamic. Each member had a role, and as long as those roles functioned together, there was little reason to examine them more closely. The transition from school to the wider conditions of the war introduced new pressures. The environment became less predictable, and the consequences of decisions carried greater weight. For someone already inclined toward caution, this shift could intensify existing fears. The presence of Voldemort and the methods used by his followers created a landscape where the threat was not always visible, but was understood to be present. In this context, Pettigrew's position changed. The qualities that had been less noticeable in a structured environment became more significant when faced with uncertainty and risk. The expectation to maintain loyalty under pressure required a form of resilience that may not have been fully developed. This does not suggest an immediate turning point, but rather a gradual movement toward a different set of choices. There may have been opportunities for this shift to be recognized. Conversations about fear, uncertainty, and the changing nature of the world could have created space for a different understanding. However, such conversations are not always easy to initiate. They require an awareness that something has changed, as well as a willingness to address it directly. Without clear signs, it is possible for these moments to pass without action. The decision to trust Pettigrew with significant responsibility later reflects the perception that he remained within the boundaries of the group's loyalty. This perception was not without foundation. His behavior had not openly contradicted that expectation, and there were no definitive actions that suggested a break from it. Yet the absence of contradiction is not the same as the presence of certainty. It leaves room for factors that are not immediately visible to influence future decisions. As the war progressed, the pressure to choose a side became more immediate. Voldemort's approach often involved identifying vulnerabilities and using them to secure allegiance. fear could be amplified, and the promise of safety, even if uncertain, could become a powerful influence. For someone already inclined toward caution, this pressure could shift the balance between loyalty and self-preservation. The process of betrayal, in this sense, is not always a sudden act. It can develop over time, shaped by internal conflict and external pressure. Pettigrew's eventual decision to align with Voldemort suggests that this process reached a point where fear outweighed other considerations. By the time this decision became visible, it had already taken form internally. There were points where intervention might have been possible. Recognition of his growing fear, combined with support or reassurance, might have altered the path he was moving along. This would have required both awareness and timing. The signs, if present, would need to be interpreted correctly, and the response would need to occur before the shift became fixed. It is also possible that the structure of the group itself influenced this outcome. Strong personalities can create a sense of stability, but they can also leave less space for quieter concerns to be expressed. If Pettigrew felt unable to communicate his fears, they would remain unaddressed, continuing to shape his decisions without external input. In this way, the strength of the group could also contribute to a form of isolation within it. The eventual consequences of his decision extend beyond the moment of betrayal. They connect to a series of events that follow, each influenced by the initial choice. When viewed from a distance, this choice appears decisive. When examined more closely, it becomes part of a longer sequence, one that includes opportunities for change that were not fully realized. Understanding this sequence does not alter what occurred, but it does reveal the presence of alternative paths. The conditions that led to Pettigrew's decision were not fixed from the beginning. They developed over time, shaped by interactions, perceptions, and responses to pressure. At various points along this path, a different outcome remained possible. This does not suggest that prevention would have been simple. It would have required awareness of factors that are not always easy to observe, as well as a willingness to act on that awareness. The complexity of human behavior, combined with the uncertainty of the environment, makes such intervention difficult. Even so, the presence of these possibilities remains, indicating that the outcome was not entirely predetermined. By observing this progression carefully, the role of subtle changes becomes more apparent. Small shifts in perception, communication, and support can influence the direction of larger events. In the case of Pettigrew, these shifts did not align in a way that altered his course. Instead, they allowed a different path to form, one that led to consequences that extended far beyond the initial decision. In this way, the fall into betrayal can be understood not as a single moment, but as a gradual movement shaped by conditions that were present long before the final choice was made. Within that movement, there were points where a different direction remained possible, though they were not taken. These points, while quiet, form part of the broader pattern that defines how preventable outcomes come into being. The Triwizard Tournament was presented as a structured event, one guided by rules, oversight, and a long tradition that suggested stability. Its purpose was not only competition, but also cooperation between schools, with each task designed to test different forms of skill. Beneath this structure, however, there were layers that depended on careful monitoring. The tasks involved real danger, and while protections were in place, they required constant attention to remain effective. Harry Potter's unexpected entry into the tournament introduced an early disruption. The Goblet of Fire, an object trusted to select champions without error, produced a result that did not align with expectation. This outcome suggested that its protections had been altered or bypassed. While this was recognized as unusual, the response focused on managing the situation within the existing framework, rather than examining how the system itself had been compromised. This approach created a condition where the tournament continued, but with an underlying uncertainty that was not fully addressed. Additional precautions were considered, yet the event was not halted. Each task proceeded as planned, with the assumption that existing safeguards would be sufficient. The presence of this assumption reduced the likelihood of identifying deeper manipulation as it developed. Cedric Diggory entered the tournament through the expected process. His selection reflected his ability and preparation, and he approached each task with a measured sense of responsibility. His path through the competition was steady, marked by decisions that balanced caution with the need to act. In many ways, his progression reflected what the tournament was intended to measure. As the tasks unfolded, there were moments where the structure held and moments where it showed signs of strain. The first task, involving dragons, was controlled through preparation and oversight. The second task, set beneath the lake, relied on time constraints and magical solutions. In each case, the environment was managed to maintain a balance between challenge and safety. Yet these measures depended on the assumption that all elements within the system remained secure. The final task introduced a different kind of complexity. The maze, designed to test navigation and judgment, created an enclosed space where visibility was limited. Within it, obstacles could be placed and adjusted, and the movement of the champions became more difficult to observe directly. This environment allowed for subtle changes to occur without immediate detection, especially if those changes were introduced gradually. By this point, Barty Crouch Jr., operating under the identity of Alastor Moody, had already influenced the tournament's progression. His actions were deliberate, guiding events toward a specific outcome. The presence of a single individual in a position of trust, able to alter conditions without detection, reflects a point where the system's oversight was not fully aligned with its intended purpose. Cedric's progress through the maze remained consistent with his earlier performance. He responded to challenges with focus, avoiding unnecessary risk where possible. Harry's path, shaped by external influence, intersected with Cedric's near the center of the maze. At this point, the Triwizard Cup, placed as the goal of the task, appeared as the final step in the competition. The decision that followed was simple and immediate. Both had reached the end, and neither had clearly surpassed the other. Sharing the victory seemed a reasonable outcome, reflecting the cooperative aspect that the tournament was meant to encourage. This decision, while aligned with the spirit of the event, did not account for the possibility that the object itself had been altered. The cup had been transformed into a portkey, a change that shifted its function entirely. This transformation was not visible, nor was it indicated by any outward sign. Without specific knowledge or suspicion, there was no clear reason to question it. The moment they both touched it, the transition occurred, moving them away from the controlled environment of the maze to a location that had not been anticipated. The graveyard where they arrived existed outside the protections of the tournament. It was not monitored, and it had been prepared in advance for a specific purpose. The shift from one environment to another happened instantly, leaving no time for adjustment or reconsideration. In this new setting, the structure that had guided the tournament no longer applied. Cedric's response in that moment was shaped by the information available to him. The sudden change in surroundings created confusion, and before a full understanding could form, the presence of another figure introduced immediate danger. The command given by Voldemort, carried out by Peter Pettigrew, resulted in Cedric's death without delay. When viewed in sequence, the events leading to this moment reveal several points where intervention might have been possible. The alteration of the Goblet of Fire indicated that the system had already been compromised. A deeper investigation at that stage might have uncovered the manipulation before the tournament progressed further. This would have required a willingness to pause the event and examine its mechanisms more closely. The presence of Barty Crouch Jr. within the school also represented a critical point. His ability to operate undetected allowed him to influence multiple aspects of the tournament. Identifying this deception earlier would have removed the source of the manipulation. This, in turn, would have prevented the conditions that led to the cup's transformation. Within the maze itself, the structure limited visibility and oversight. Additional monitoring, or a design that allowed for clearer observation might have made it more difficult to introduce changes without detection. While the maze was intended to test independence, this independence also reduced the ability to respond quickly to unexpected developments. The decision to share the victory, while reasonable in context, intersected with these earlier conditions. If the cup had not been altered, this decision would have led to a different outcome. The fact that it did not reflects how multiple elements combined to create a situation where a single action carried unintended consequences. Timing also played a role. The transition from the maze to the graveyard occurred immediately, leaving no opportunity for intervention once the cup was touched. Preventative action would have needed to occur earlier, at one of the preceding points where the system showed signs of strain. By the time the final task was underway, the conditions for the outcome had largely been set. Cedric's death, in this sense, was not the result of a single failure, but of a sequence of decisions and oversights that aligned in a specific way. Each part of the system functioned within its expected limits, yet those limits did not account for the possibility of coordinated manipulation. The presence of this gap allowed the sequence to continue without interruption. Looking back, the preventability of this event becomes more visible. Each stage contained a point where a different choice or a deeper awareness might have altered the course of what followed. These points were not always obvious at the time, but they existed within the structure of the event. Their presence suggests that the outcome was not fixed, but shaped by the way these elements interacted. By examining this sequence slowly, the pattern becomes clearer. The initial disruption, the continuation of the event without full resolution, the influence of a hidden agent, and the final convergence at the cup all form part of a connected process. Within that process, the difference between what occurred and what might have occurred remains narrow, defined by moments where the system nearly adjusted but did not fully change direction. Authority within the wizarding world often depends on the assumption that those who hold it maintain a clear awareness of what occurs under their responsibility. In the case of Barty Crouch Sr., this assumption appeared consistent for many years. He was known for his strict adherence to rules, his firm approach to justice, and his ability to act decisively in moments that required control. His position within the Ministry of Magic reflected this reputation, placing him in roles where order and discipline were considered essential. Beneath this outward structure, however, there were decisions that introduced a different kind of uncertainty. His son, Barty Crouch Jr., had been convicted as a follower of Voldemort, associated with acts that marked him as part of a group defined by loyalty to a rising threat. The response to this conviction followed the established system, resulting in imprisonment within Azkaban. At that stage, the process appeared complete, with the expectation that the outcome would remain fixed. The decision to alter this outcome did not occur publicly. It took place within a more private space, shaped by personal considerations that were not visible within the broader system. Barty Crouch Sr., influenced by his wife's condition and her final wishes, arranged for his son to be removed from Azkaban. This action required planning, secrecy, and the use of magic that allowed one life to be exchanged for another without immediate detection. The method used relied on transformation and concealment. Through the use of Polyjuice Potion, Barty Crouch Jr. was disguised, while his mother took his place within the prison. This exchange, once completed, removed him from the direct control of the ministry while maintaining the appearance that the original sentence remained in effect. The system continued to function as if nothing had changed, unaware that one of its key outcomes had been altered. Following this exchange, Barty Crouch Jr. was kept under strict control within his family home. His father used the Imperious Curse to manage his actions, ensuring that he remained compliant and hidden. This approach created a contained environment, one where the risk of exposure appeared limited. The control was constant, and as long as it remained in place, the situation did not extend beyond the boundaries that had been set. This arrangement depended on continuous oversight. The Imperious Curse required reinforcement, and any lapse in attention could allow resistance to form. In this sense, the stability of the situation was tied directly to the ability of one individual to maintain control over another. While this may have seemed sufficient in the short term, it introduced a point where failure could occur without immediate warning. There were also external factors that influenced this arrangement. Winky, the house elf assigned to the Crouch household, played a role in maintaining the secrecy of the situation. Her loyalty and adherence to instructions helped sustain the concealment, but her understanding of events was shaped by her position. She followed commands, even when those commands contributed to a structure that relied on continued isolation. Over time, the conditions within this arrangement began to shift. The Imperious Curse, while effective, does not remove the capacity for resistance entirely. It suppresses it, creating a layer of control that can weaken, if not maintained, with precision. The longer the arrangement continued, the more it depended on consistency without interruption. The Quidditch World Cup provided a moment where this consistency was tested. In a setting where large numbers of people gathered, the control over Barty Crouch Jr. was temporarily altered. He was brought into an environment that extended beyond the confines of his home, introducing variables that were more difficult to manage. Within this setting, the influence of the Imperious Curse weakened, allowing him to act independently for a brief period. This moment, though limited, represented a point where the structure of control began to break. His actions during the event, including the casting of the Dark Mark, indicated that the underlying allegiance had not changed. The presence of this action also suggested that the risk had been present for some time, even if it had not been fully realized. Following this event, attempts were made to restore control, but the stability of the arrangement had already been compromised. The reliance on a single method of containment, without additional safeguards, meant that once that method weakened, there were few alternatives in place. The situation began to move beyond the limits that had been set, though not immediately visible to those outside the household. At the same time, the broader environment was changing. Voldemort's influence, though not yet fully restored, was beginning to extend again. This shift created conditions where individuals aligned with him could act with increasing confidence. Barty Crouch Jr., once freed from complete control, became part of this movement, eventually taking on a role that allowed him to operate within Hogwarts itself. The presence of Barty Crouch Jr. within the school, under the identity of Alastor Moody, reflects a continuation of the earlier failure to contain him effectively. His ability to assume this position depended on multiple factors aligning, including his escape from control, his connection to Voldemort, and the lack of detection within the system that had once held authority over him. Barty Crouch Sr., meanwhile, became aware that the situation had shifted beyond his control. His movements during this period suggest an attempt to respond, to reassert awareness over what had been lost. However, his isolation, combined with the secrecy of his earlier actions, limited his ability to seek support. The system that might have assisted him remained unaware of the full situation, and without that awareness, it could not respond effectively. His eventual death occurred before he could fully communicate what he had discovered. This moment represents the final point where the sequence might have been altered. If he had been able to convey the information he held, it could have led to a different understanding of events within Hogwarts and the broader environment. The absence of that communication allowed the situation to continue without interruption. When viewed in sequence, the events surrounding Barty Crouch Sr. reveal a pattern shaped by secrecy, control, and limited awareness. The initial decision to remove his son from Azkaban created a condition that depended on ongoing management. This management, while effective for a time, did not account for the possibility of gradual change within the person being controlled. There were multiple points where intervention might have been possible. Maintaining transparency within the system, rather than relying on secrecy, could have allowed for shared responsibility. Additional safeguards beyond the Imperious Curse might have reduced the risk of escape. Monitoring changes in behavior over time could have provided early indication of weakening control. Each of these points represents a moment where the outcome might have shifted. They are not separate from one another, but part of a continuous sequence that connects the initial decision to the final result. The distance between these points is measured not only in time, but in the accumulation of small changes that gradually altered the structure of the situation. By examining these events slowly, the role of awareness becomes more apparent. Authority, when combined with secrecy, can create conditions where important information remains isolated. Without that information, decisions are made within a limited frame, reducing the ability to respond to changes as they occur. In this way, the death of Barty Crouch Sr. is connected to the earlier choices that shaped his circumstances. It reflects not a single moment of failure, but a series of decisions that relied on control without full visibility. Within that series, there were points where a different approach might have led to a different outcome, though those points were not fully realized as the events unfolded. Bertha Jorkins worked within the Ministry of Magic in a position that required attention to detail but did not place her at the center of decision-making. Her role involved handling information that passed through different departments, and over time she became familiar with procedures, records, and the small inconsistencies that sometimes appeared within them. This familiarity allowed her to notice details that others might overlook, though it did not always provide a clear understanding of their significance. At an earlier point in her career, she encountered information connected to the Crouch family. The details she uncovered were not widely known, and they suggested that events surrounding Barty Crouch Jr. did not align fully with what had been recorded. Her response to this discovery brought her into direct contact with Barty Crouch Sr. Rather than allowing the information to move through official channels, he chose to act privately, placing a powerful memory charm on her. This charm did not function as a simple concealment. It altered her memory in a way that disrupted its structure, removing specific knowledge while leaving other parts intact. The process was not precise, and the effect extended beyond the intended target. Over time, this created a pattern where her recollections became less stable. She would forget details, misplace information, and struggle to maintain a consistent awareness of events. Within the ministry, these changes were noticeable but not fully understood. Her colleagues observed that she was often forgetful, sometimes absent from her duties without clear explanation. These behaviors were attributed to her own disposition rather than to an external cause. Without recognition of the underlying reason, there was no effort to address it through appropriate means. The condition remained, shaping her interactions and decisions without direct acknowledgement. The damage to her memory also affected her ability to assess risk. Situations that might have prompted caution were not always interpreted as such. Her sense of continuity, which allows a person to connect past experiences with present circumstances, was weakened. As a result, her responses to unfamiliar environments were less guarded, and her awareness of potential danger was reduced. At a later point, Bertha Jorkins travelled outside of Britain. This journey was not unusual in itself, but it placed her in a setting where the protections of the ministry were no longer present. Without the structure of her usual environment, she relied more heavily on her own judgment. Given the condition of her memory, this reliance introduced a degree of vulnerability that might not have been fully recognized at the time. During this period, she encountered Voldemort, who was in a weakened but still active state. His ability to recognize opportunity did not depend on strength alone. It depended on awareness of vulnerability, and Bertha's condition made her particularly susceptible. When he captured her, the process that followed involved the extraction of information through force, breaking through the memory charm that had been placed upon her. The breaking of this charm revealed not only the information she had discovered about the Crouch family, but also details about the current state of the wizarding world. In this way, a measure that had been intended to conceal one set of facts contributed indirectly to the exposure of another. The initial decision to use a memory charm, rather than address the situation openly, created a condition that extended beyond its original purpose. Her death followed soon after, occurring in a context where intervention was no longer possible. The absence of oversight, combined with her isolation, meant that there were no immediate means of assistance. The sequence of events had moved beyond the reach of the systems that might have provided protection. When viewed in sequence, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to several earlier points. The initial use of the memory charm, while intended to contain information, introduced long-term instability. If a different approach had been taken, one that addressed the situation through official channels, the need for such a charm might not have arisen. This would have preserved her memory in its original form, maintaining her ability to assess situations more clearly. Within the ministry, there were also opportunities to recognize the effects of the charm. Her behavior changed in observable ways, suggesting that something was affecting her ability to function consistently. A closer examination of these changes might have led to the discovery of the underlying cause. With that awareness, it may have been possible to reverse or mitigate the effects before they became more pronounced. Her travel outside the country represents another point where conditions shifted. While such travel was not inherently dangerous, it required a degree of independence that her condition did not fully support. Additional guidance or oversight during this period might have reduced the likelihood of her encountering situations beyond her ability to manage. The encounter with Voldemort, while influenced by circumstance, also reflects the broader environment in which he operated. His presence in Albania was not widely known, and the lack of awareness within the wizarding world allowed him to remain undetected. A more complete understanding of his movements at that time might have altered the conditions that led to their meeting. Each of these elements contributes to a pattern where small decisions and overlooked details combine to shape a larger outcome. The memory charm, the absence of recognition within the ministry, the conditions of her travel, and the lack of awareness of Voldemort's presence all intersect within a sequence that leads to her death. None of these elements alone determines the result, but together they create a path that becomes difficult to alter once it is fully formed. By examining this sequence slowly, the role of knowledge and its management becomes more apparent. Information that is concealed or altered does not disappear entirely. It changes form, influencing events in ways that may not be immediately visible. In this case, the attempt to control one piece of information contributed to the creation of vulnerability in another area. There is also a quiet presence of missed recognition throughout this sequence. Signs of change were visible, though not fully interpreted. Opportunities to respond existed, though they were not acted upon in a way that altered the course of events. These moments, while small, form part of the larger structure that defines how preventable outcomes develop. In the end, Bertha Jorkin's death reflects a convergence of factors that began long before her final encounter. The path leading to it is shaped by decisions made in private, conditions that were not fully understood, and a system that did not recognize the significance of the changes occurring within it. When viewed together, these elements reveal how closely the outcome was tied to the sequence that preceded it, and how different choices at earlier points might have led to a different result. The events that led to Sirius Black's death developed through a sequence that appeared clear in the moment, but becomes more complex when viewed slowly. At the center of this sequence was a vision experienced by Harry Potter, one that showed Sirius within the Department of Mysteries, under visible threat. The image carried urgency, presenting itself as immediate and real. Within that urgency, there was little space to question its origin or accuracy. It seemed to require action without delay. The source of the vision was not fully understood at the time. Harry had experienced similar impressions before, some of which had reflected real events, while others carried elements that were less certain. This pattern created a form of partial trust. The visions were neither entirely reliable nor entirely false. In this instance, the lack of clear distinction between these possibilities influenced the decision that followed. The Department of Mysteries itself was a place that held restricted knowledge, managed by individuals who worked outside the usual structure of the ministry. Its location within the ministry building gave it a sense of proximity to authority, yet its purpose remained distant from ordinary understanding. The idea that Sirius could be held there suggested a situation that was both urgent and unusual, reinforcing the need to respond quickly. Harry's attempt to confirm the vision was limited. The communication methods available to him were constrained, and the urgency of the moment reduced the likelihood of exploring them fully. There were ways to reach Sirius, including a mirror that had been given to him earlier. This object, if used, would have allowed direct communication without delay. However, its presence was not fully integrated into his awareness at that moment. The possibility it represented remained unused. Instead, the response took a different path. Harry and his companions chose to travel to the Ministry directly, acting on the assumption that the vision reflected an immediate reality. This decision was shaped by trust in what had been seen, combined with the absence of a clear alternative. The time required to verify the information through other means was perceived as a risk, as it might allow harm to occur if the vision was accurate. At the same time, those who might have provided guidance were not fully accessible. Communication with members of the Order of the Phoenix was limited, and the structure within Hogwarts did not allow for rapid consultation in moments of uncertainty. This created a condition where a decision had to be made with incomplete information, increasing the likelihood that the chosen course of action would reflect the urgency of the situation rather than its full context. The journey to the Ministry placed Harry and his companions within an environment that was not prepared for their arrival. The Department of Mysteries, while part of a controlled structure, was not designed for open access. Once inside, the absence of immediate supervision allowed the situation to develop without interruption. The vision that had prompted the journey began to reveal its nature as they moved through the space, but by that point, they were already within it. Sirius Black, meanwhile, was not present in the way the vision had suggested. He had not been captured or brought to the Department of Mysteries. The image had been shaped to create that impression, drawing Harry into a location where Voldemort's followers were waiting. This form of misdirection relied on the connection between Harry and Voldemort, using it to present information that appeared reliable but was not. The confrontation that followed involved multiple participants, each acting within a rapidly changing environment. Members of the Order arrived to assist, including Sirius, who entered the situation in response to the unfolding conflict. His presence at that moment was a result of the same sequence that had drawn Harry to the Ministry, connecting their actions within a single chain of events. During the battle, movement was constant, and the conditions were difficult to control. Spells were exchanged across shifting positions, and the environment itself introduced obstacles that influenced how those spells moved. Within this complexity, the distinction between controlled action and unpredictable outcome became less clear. The moment of Sirius's death occurred within this shifting context. Bellatrix Lestrange cast a spell that struck him, sending him backward through a veil within the chamber. The veil itself was not widely understood, but its effect was immediate and final. The proximity of Sirius to this structure, combined with the timing of the spell, created a point where the outcome was determined in an instant. When viewed in isolation, this moment appears sudden, shaped by the unpredictability of combat. When placed within the sequence that preceded it, it becomes connected to earlier decisions and conditions. The vision, the choice to act without full verification, the unused means of communication, and the resulting presence within the department all contribute to the circumstances in which the moment occurred. There were opportunities within this sequence where the outcome might have been altered. The use of the mirror could have confirmed Sirius's safety, removing the need for immediate action. Greater awareness of the possibility of manipulated visions might have introduced caution, allowing time for verification. Communication with the Order, if established earlier, could have provided guidance that changed the course of events. Even within the battle itself, positioning played a role. The location of the veil, combined with the movement of those involved, created a condition where proximity became significant. A slight difference in position, or a change in movement at that moment, might have led to a different result. These possibilities exist within the structure of the event, though they are not immediately visible when viewed at full speed. The pattern that emerges from this sequence reflects the interaction between perception and action. Information that appears urgent can lead to decisions made with limited verification. These decisions, once acted upon, create new conditions that carry their own risks. Each step moves forward from the one before it, forming a path that becomes more difficult to alter as it develops. Sirius Black's death, in this context, is not defined by a single moment alone. It is shaped by the sequence that led to that moment, including the elements that nearly changed direction but did not fully do so. The closeness of these alternative paths suggests that the outcome was not fixed from the beginning, but influenced by the way each part of the sequence unfolded. By examining this progression slowly, the role of misdirection becomes more apparent. The vision, while compelling, did not represent the reality it appeared to show. The response to it, shaped by urgency, allowed the misdirection to achieve its purpose. Within this process, the difference between what was seen and what was true created the space where the outcome took form. This understanding does not change the events themselves, but it clarifies how they are connected. The preventability of the loss lies within the points where perception might have been questioned, where communication might have been used differently, and where timing might have shifted the sequence. These points remain quiet, existing alongside the events as they occurred, showing how closely the outcome was tied to the path that led to it. Communication within the wizarding world often moves through layered systems, some formal and others more personal. Messages pass between individuals, through enchanted objects, and across institutional structures that are designed to organize and protect information. These systems function with a certain consistency, yet they depend on timing, clarity, and the willingness to share what is known. When any of these elements becomes limited, the movement of information slows, and the understanding of events becomes less complete. Within Hogwarts, communication is shaped by boundaries between students and adults. Knowledge is often distributed according to age, responsibility, and perceived readiness. This structure creates a sense of order, but it also means that certain information remains withheld. Students may act without full awareness of the context surrounding them, while adults may assume that withholding details will provide protection. In practice, this separation can create moments where actions are taken based on partial understanding. The Order of the Phoenix operates within a different structure, one defined by secrecy and controlled sharing. Information is passed among members with care, often limited to what is considered necessary for a specific task. This approach reduces the risk of exposure, but it also narrows the range of perspectives available at any given moment. If a situation changes, those outside a particular exchange may not recognize the shift until it is already in progress. Between these systems, there exists a space where communication becomes uncertain. In this space, assumptions begin to form. Individuals fill gaps in their understanding with what seems most likely, and these assumptions guide their actions. When the underlying information is incomplete, the resulting decisions reflect that limitation. The presence of enchanted communication methods introduces another layer to this process. Objects such as mirrors, coins, or other linked items can provide direct contact between individuals, bypassing traditional channels. These methods offer a way to reduce delay, yet they depend on awareness and use. If an object is forgotten, set aside, or not fully understood, its potential remains unrealized. The possibility of immediate communication exists, but it does not influence events unless it is actively used. The unused mirror given to Harry Potter illustrates this pattern. It was intended as a direct link, allowing him to reach Sirius Black without delay. Its presence created an opportunity for clarity, a way to confirm information before acting. However, its role was not fully integrated into his understanding. In a moment where urgency shaped perception, the memory of this object did not align with the need for immediate action. The connection it offered remained unused, leaving the flow of information incomplete. Delays also occur within formal systems. Messages sent through the ministry or through owl post require time to reach their destination. In situations where events develop quickly, this delay becomes significant. A response that arrives after a decision has been made cannot alter that decision. The timing of communication, therefore, influences not only what is known, but when it is known in relation to action. There are also instances where information is intentionally withheld. This may be done to protect individuals, to prevent panic, or to maintain control over a situation. While the intention behind this choice may be measured, its effect is to limit the range of understanding available to others. Those who act without this information do so within a narrower frame, increasing the likelihood that their actions will not align with the full reality of the situation. Misinterpretation further shapes the flow of communication. Even when information is shared, it may not be understood in the way it was intended. Differences in perspective, experience, and context influence how messages are received. A statement that appears clear to one person may carry a different meaning to another. This variation creates a layer of uncertainty where the same information can lead to different conclusions. In moments of urgency, the ability to verify information becomes limited. The need to respond quickly reduces the time available for confirmation, and decisions are made based on what appears most immediate. This creates a condition where the first piece of information received carries greater weight, even if it is incomplete. Subsequent information, arriving later, may not alter the initial response if action has already begun. The accumulation of these factors forms a pattern where communication does not fail entirely, but functions in a way that leaves gaps. These gaps are not always visible at the time. They become more apparent when events are viewed in sequence, revealing how each moment of incomplete understanding contributed to the next. Deaths that occur within this pattern are often connected to these gaps. A warning that arrives too late, a message that is not sent, or a tool that is not used all represent points where the flow of information might have been different. These points are small in isolation, yet they carry significance when placed within the larger sequence of events. There are instances where communication comes close to altering an outcome. A message may reach its destination just before a critical moment, or a conversation may provide enough clarity to change a decision. These moments suggest that the system is not entirely limited. It has the capacity to function effectively, but its success depends on alignment between timing, awareness, and action. When this alignment does not occur, the result is not immediate failure, but a gradual divergence from what might have been possible. Each missed connection adds to the distance between understanding and reality. Over time, this distance shapes the conditions in which decisions are made, influencing the outcomes that follow. The role of communication, then, is not only to transmit information, but to connect individuals within a shared understanding of events. When this connection is incomplete, actions are taken within separate interpretations of the same situation. These interpretations may overlap in some areas, but they do not fully align, creating a structure where coordination becomes more difficult. By observing these patterns slowly, the presence of preventable moments becomes clearer. They exist in the spaces where communication might have been more direct, more timely, or more complete. The difference between what occurred and what might have occurred is often defined by these spaces, where a single message or a brief exchange could have shifted the direction of events. This understanding does not assign weight to any single point, but rather to the sequence as a whole. Communication flows continuously, and its influence extends across multiple moments. When it moves without interruption, it supports alignment between perception and action. When it becomes fragmented, it introduces uncertainty that shapes outcomes in quieter ways. In this way, the deaths connected to these patterns are not only the result of direct action, but also of the conditions that allowed those actions to occur. Within those conditions, the flow of information plays a central role, guiding decisions and shaping the path that leads from one moment to the next. Albus Dumbledore's death is often understood as intentional, arranged in advance as part of a broader plan. When viewed slowly, the sequence that led to it reveals a structure that was carefully maintained, yet not without alternative possibilities. The path toward that moment began earlier, when he encountered a ring that carried a hidden curse. The object itself held significance beyond its surface, connected to a deeper layer of magic that required careful handling. In the moment it was found, the decision to engage with it directly introduced a condition that would shape everything that followed. The curse acted quickly, spreading through his hand and threatening to move further. Severus Snape intervened, containing its progression and limiting its immediate effect. This action preserved time, though not indefinitely. The containment did not remove the curse, but held it in place, creating a period during which its consequences would unfold more slowly. Within this period, Dumbledore's awareness of his remaining time influenced his decisions. The knowledge that the curse would eventually lead to his death created a framework in which future actions were considered. Rather than seeking a way to reverse the effect completely, the focus shifted toward managing its outcome. This included the decision to arrange his death under specific conditions, assigning that role to Severus Snape. The arrangement was intended to serve multiple purposes, preserving Snape's position within Voldemort's circle while also preventing another from being placed in that role. Draco Malfoy's involvement added another layer to this structure. Tasked by Voldemort with carrying out the act, Draco was placed under pressure that extended beyond his experience. His attempts to fulfill this task involved indirect methods, each carrying risk and uncertainty. These efforts suggested hesitation, as well as a lack of readiness to complete the act directly. The presence of this hesitation created a space where the outcome was not entirely fixed. Within Hogwarts, the progression of these events unfolded alongside other activities, maintaining the appearance of continuity. Dumbledore continued his role, guiding and observing, while also preparing for the conclusion that had been arranged. His interactions with Harry included moments where information was shared, though not always fully explained. This selective disclosure reflected a pattern that had appeared before, where knowledge was given in measured portions rather than as a complete account. There were points within this sequence where alternative approaches might have been considered. The curse itself, while powerful, was contained rather than explored for possible reversal. Magical knowledge within the wizarding world includes methods that can address complex enchantments, though their success is not always certain. A deeper investigation into the nature of the curse, combined with broader consultation, might have extended the available options. The arrangement with Snape also reflects a decision shaped by multiple considerations. It was designed to achieve a specific outcome, balancing immediate needs with longer-term strategy. However, this approach depended on precise timing and coordination. Any variation within these elements could alter the results. If Draco had acted differently, or if circumstances had shifted, the sequence might not have unfolded as planned. The night of Dumbledore's death brought these elements together within a single moment. Returning to Hogwarts after retrieving another object connected to Voldemort's past, he arrived in a weakened state. The journey had required effort, and the effects of the curse remained present. Upon reaching the astronomy tower, he encountered Draco, who had succeeded in bringing him to a position where the task could be completed. Draco's hesitation was visible. The expectation placed upon him did not align fully with his ability to carry it out. This moment represents a point where the sequence paused briefly, where the outcome had not yet been decided. Dumbledore's response during this pause focused on understanding and reassurance, suggesting that an alternative path might still be possible. The arrival of other figures shifted the conditions again. The situation moved from a private confrontation to a shared space where multiple roles intersected. Severus Snape's presence brought the earlier arrangement into effect. The act that followed was carried out as planned. bringing the sequence to its intended conclusion. When viewed from a distance, this moment appears as a controlled ending, shaped by deliberate choices. When examined more closely, it reveals a series of decisions that narrowed the range of possible outcomes over time. Each choice reduced the number of alternatives, guiding the sequence toward a specific point. There were opportunities within this progression where the path might have changed. A different response to the ring could have avoided the curse entirely. A broader approach to addressing its effects might have extended the time available for other solutions. Greater openness and communication could have allowed additional perspectives to influence the decisions being made. The involvement of Draco also introduced variability. His hesitation suggests that the outcome was not fully fixed until the final moment. If his actions had diverged from expectation, or if support had reached him earlier, the sequence might have taken a different form. The reliance on a single plan, without flexibility for such changes, created a structure that depended on alignment across multiple elements. The role of secrecy within this process is also significant. Much of the plan was known only to a small number of individuals, limiting the possibility of external intervention. While this secrecy served a purpose, it also reduced the range of responses available when conditions shifted. Information that might have prompted a different approach remained confined, influencing events without being fully shared. Dumbledore's death, in this context, reflects both intention and limitation. It was arranged to achieve certain outcomes, yet it was also shaped by earlier decisions that reduced the available options. The presence of these limitations suggests that the outcome was not the only possible one, but the one that remained after other paths had been set aside. By examining this sequence slowly, the interplay between choice and circumstance becomes more apparent. Each decision carried weight, not only in its immediate effect, but in how it influenced what could follow. The accumulation of these decisions formed a path that led to a specific conclusion, while leaving traces of alternatives that were not fully explored. The concept of preventability within this context does not rest on a single moment, but on the sequence as a whole. It emerges from the points where different choices might have led to different conditions, altering the structure of what followed. These points remain present within the sequence, offering a quieter understanding of how the outcome came to be shaped over time. Severus Snape's position within the conflict was defined by distance, though he remained close to both sides. He moved between them without fully belonging to either, carrying information that could not be shared openly. This role required careful balance, where each action needed to align with two separate expectations at once. Any shift in that balance could alter how he was perceived, and with it, the stability of his position. His early decision to bring part of a prophecy to Voldemort created the first connection in this sequence. The information was incomplete, yet it was enough to guide Voldemort's attention toward a specific outcome. At the time, the full consequences of sharing it were not visible. It existed as a fragment, separated from the events it would later influence. Once understood more fully, however, its significance changed, leading Snape to seek a different course. This shift brought him into contact with Albus Dumbledore, creating an agreement that would define his actions moving forward. His allegiance became layered, with one aspect visible and another concealed. Maintaining this structure required consistency over time. Each interaction, each decision, needed to support the appearance that he remained aligned with Voldemort, while also contributing to efforts that opposed him. Within this arrangement, there were moments where the flow of information could have altered outcomes. Snape's access to Voldemort's plans provided insight that was not widely available. If shared more broadly, this knowledge might have influenced how certain situations were approached. However, the need to preserve his position limited how and when he could communicate. Information was passed selectively, often reaching only a small number of individuals. This limitation created conditions where knowledge existed but was not fully distributed. Those who might have benefited from it acted without awareness of what Snape knew. Their decisions reflected the information available to them, which did not always include the broader context. In this way, the structure that allowed Snape to gather information also restricted its use. There were also instances where Snape's actions directly influenced the course of events. His role in protecting Harry at various points demonstrates an ability to intervene when necessary. These interventions often occurred quietly, without recognition, altering outcomes in ways that were not immediately visible. At the same time, there were moments where intervention was not possible, either due to timing or the need to maintain his cover. The arrangement with Dumbledore regarding his death represents a point where intention and necessity intersected. Snape was given a task that aligned with both his visible role and his concealed purpose. Carrying out this task required precise timing and the ability to act without hesitation. The decision to proceed in this way shaped the conditions that followed, influencing how others understood the event. Within Hogwarts, Snape's position as a teacher placed him in regular contact with students who were not aware of his broader role. His behavior, often perceived as distant or severe, contributed to this lack of understanding. The separation between his actions and his intentions created a gap where his true position remained hidden. This gap influenced how others responded to him, shaping interactions that might have been different with greater awareness. There were points where communication between Snape and others could have been expanded. Sharing more information might have allowed for a more coordinated response to certain situations. However, this would have introduced risk, potentially exposing his role and undermining the structure that allowed him to operate. The decision to limit communication reflects a balance between immediate clarity and long-term strategy. The complexity of his position also affected how he interpreted events. Holding information from multiple perspectives required constant adjustment. Situations that appeared straightforward to others carried additional layers for him, influencing how he responded. This perspective allowed him to anticipate certain outcomes, yet it also constrained his ability to act freely. As the conflict progressed, the accumulation of these conditions shaped the range of possible actions. Each decision reinforced the structure in which he operated, making it more difficult to deviate without consequence. The path he followed became defined by this structure, with fewer opportunities to alter its direction as time went on. The end of his role came at a moment where the balance could no longer be maintained. Voldemort's understanding of the Elder Wand led to a decision that placed Snape in direct danger. The reasoning behind this decision was based on incomplete knowledge, reflecting the same pattern of misinterpretation that had appeared elsewhere. Snape's death occurred within this context, shaped by a sequence that had been building over time. Looking back, there are points where the outcome might have been different. The initial sharing of the prophecy could have been approached with greater caution, preventing its influence from extending as it did. Later, the distribution of information might have been adjusted, allowing others to act with a fuller understanding. Even near the end, the interpretation of the Elder Wand's allegiance could have been clarified, altering the conditions that led to his death. These possibilities exist within the sequence as points of divergence, where a different choice might have shifted the path. They do not stand apart from the events, but are part of the same structure, connected to the decisions that were made. The presence of these alternatives suggests that the outcome was not entirely fixed, but shaped by the way information was managed and understood. By examining this progression slowly, the role of partial prevention becomes more visible. Snape's actions did prevent certain outcomes, even as they could not prevent others. This balance reflects the limits of operating within a constrained position, where each action carries both protective and restrictive effects. The pattern that emerges is one where knowledge and silence exist together. Information is gathered and used, yet not fully shared. Actions are taken, yet not always explained. Within this pattern, the difference between what is known and what is acted upon becomes significant, influencing the direction of events in ways that are not immediately apparent. In this way, Snape's position illustrates how preventable outcomes can be shaped not only by what is done, but by what remains unspoken. The spaces between knowledge and action, between intention and perception, form part of the structure that defines how events unfold. Within those spaces, small changes might have led to different results, though they were not fully realized as the sequence continued. Charity Burbage lived and worked within a structure that had long appeared stable. As a professor at Hogwarts, her role involved teaching Muggle studies, a subject that required careful explanation of a world that many students did not fully understand. Her approach emphasized connection rather than separation, presenting non-magical people as part of a shared environment rather than as something distant or lesser. This perspective, while consistent with her position as an educator, placed her within a developing tension that was not always visible in ordinary conditions. As Voldemort's influence began to return, attitudes within the wizarding world shifted. Ideas that had once existed at the edges became more central, gaining visibility through quiet agreement and, in some cases, open support. The belief in pure blood superiority, which had never fully disappeared, began to shape decisions in more direct ways. Within this change, individuals who held opposing views became more exposed, not because their positions had altered, but because the environment around them had. Charity's work, by its nature, stood in contrast to these emerging views. Her writing, including articles that reached beyond the classroom, reflected her commitment to presenting Muggles as equal participants in society. These expressions were not framed as acts of resistance, but they carried a clarity that made them visible to those who opposed them. Over time, this visibility increased, aligning her identity with a position that would later draw direct attention. The structures that might have provided protection did not fully adjust to these changes. Hogwarts continued to operate, maintaining its routines and expectations, even as the conditions beyond its grounds became less stable. The Ministry of Magic, undergoing its own transformation, did not act consistently in addressing threats against individuals whose views placed them at risk. In this environment, the boundary between safety and exposure became less defined. There were points where the shifting conditions might have prompted a different response. Increased awareness of the risks associated with public expression could have led to protective measures, such as relocation or reduced visibility. Communication within trusted networks might have provided warning, allowing time to adjust before direct action was taken against her. These possibilities existed within the structure, though they were not fully realized. The moment of her capture reflects the convergence of these conditions. Without the presence of immediate protection, and without a coordinated system to respond to targeted threats, she was taken and brought into a setting controlled by Voldemort and his followers. This transition occurred outside the awareness of those who might have intervened, illustrating how quickly a situation can change when oversight is limited. Within that setting, her presence was used as a demonstration. The gathering around her served not only as a moment of decision, but as a display intended to reinforce a particular set of beliefs. Her position, suspended and observed, reflected the shift from individual identity to symbolic representation. In this form, her life became part of a larger message, one that extended beyond her as a person. The absence of intervention at this stage was not due to a single factor, but to the accumulation of earlier conditions. The lack of consistent protection, the delay in recognizing the level of threat, and the separation between individuals and the systems that might have supported them all contributed to a situation where response was not immediate. By the time her location was known, if it was known at all, the sequence had already moved beyond the point where it could be altered. Her death followed within this context, shaped by a structure that had allowed her to become exposed without adequate support. When viewed slowly, the sequence reveals moments where the outcome might have been different. Greater awareness of the changing environment could have prompted earlier action. Stronger coordination between institutions might have provided a more effective response. Direct communication of risk might have altered her position before she became a target. These possibilities exist as part of the same sequence, not separate from it. They represent points where the path might have shifted, though it did not. The difference between what occurred and what might have occurred is defined by these points, where small changes in awareness or response could have influenced the direction of events. The pattern that emerges reflects the interaction between belief and structure. As beliefs within the broader environment changed, the structures designed to maintain stability did not adjust at the same pace. This created a gap where individuals whose positions were visible became more vulnerable. Within this gap, the presence of risk increased without a corresponding increase in protection. Charity Burbage's death, in this sense, is connected to the timing of these changes. It occurred at a point where the shift in belief had become strong enough to act openly, while the systems that might have responded were still operating within earlier assumptions. This misalignment allowed the sequence to unfold without interruption. By observing these events carefully, the role of visibility becomes clearer. Her work, while consistent and measured, placed her in a position where she could be identified as representing a particular perspective. In a stable environment, this visibility carried little risk. In a changing environment, it became a factor that influenced how she was perceived and how others chose to act. The preventability of this outcome lies within the earlier moments where alignment between awareness and response might have been established. Recognition of the shift in conditions, combined with timely action, could have created a different path. These elements were present, though not fully connected in a way that altered the sequence. In the end, her death reflects a pattern where the environment changed more quickly than the systems within it. Individuals moved within that environment according to the understanding available to them, which did not always reflect the full extent of the change. Within this difference, the conditions for preventable loss emerged, shaped by the interaction between what was known and what had not yet been fully realized. The plan to move Harry Potter from Privet Drive was built with careful intention, designed to reduce the likelihood that his true position could be identified during transit. By creating multiple identical versions of him, each accompanied by a different protector, the plan aimed to divide attention and distribute risk. This approach relied on the assumption that confusion would provide protection, making it more difficult for those pursuing him to determine which target was real. Within this structure, each participant accepted a defined role. The use of Polyjuice Potion allowed others to take on Harry's appearance, while he himself was placed with a specific escort. The success of the plan depended on consistency, with each group following its assigned path and maintaining the illusion that any one of them could be the true target. The moment of departure was timed to reduce visibility, aligning with conditions that would limit observation. As the groups moved into the air, the environment shifted quickly. The presence of Death Eaters indicated that the plan had been anticipated or revealed in some way. This introduced immediate pressure, reducing the effectiveness of the original design. The assumption that confusion would provide sufficient protection became less certain, as those pursuing them acted with coordination and intent. Hedwig's presence within this sequence was quiet at first. She had been a constant companion, often carried in a cage during travel. Positioned close to Harry in a way that reflected familiarity rather than strategy. In this instance, her placement followed that same pattern, not adjusted to account for the different conditions created by the plan. Her visibility remained tied to Harry's position, creating a link that had not been fully considered within the structure of the escape. As the attack intensified, movement became less controlled. Spells were exchanged across the open space, and each group responded to immediate threats rather than to the broader plan. Within this shifting environment, small actions began to carry greater significance. Decisions were made quickly, often based on instinct rather than careful consideration. Harry's reaction to the presence of danger reflected this shift. His responses were shaped by familiarity with certain spells and by a sense of responsibility toward those around him. In this context, his use of a specific spell identified him in a way that distinguished him from the others. The pattern of his actions, consistent with his past behavior, became a point of recognition within the confusion. Hedwig's movement occurred within this same moment. Her position, close to Harry, meant that any change in his situation affected her as well. When she moved in response to the threat, it created a brief interruption in the pattern of the escape. This movement, while instinctive, drew attention to the connection between her and Harry. In a situation where identity was meant to remain uncertain, this connection introduced clarity. The attack that followed reached her directly, ending her presence within the sequence. The moment was brief, occurring within the larger flow of the escape. Its immediacy left little space for response, as the focus of those involved remained on continuing movement and avoiding further harm. Within the broader event, it became one of many points where the conditions of the plan had shifted beyond their original design. When viewed slowly, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to earlier decisions. The inclusion of Hedwig within the escape, without adjustment for visibility, created a condition where her presence could influence the identification of the real target. If she had been relocated or concealed in a different way, the link between her and Harry might not have been as clear. The structure of the plan itself also contributed to the conditions that followed. While it accounted for division and confusion, it did not fully anticipate the level of coordination among those pursuing them. Additional layers of protection, or alternative methods of transport, might have reduced exposure within the open environment. The reliance on flight, while effective in some respects, placed each group within a space where visibility could not be entirely controlled. There were also moments within the escape where timing influenced outcomes. The point at which Harry's actions revealed his identity occurred within a sequence of rapid responses. If those responses had differed slightly, or if the conditions had allowed for a more measured approach, the identification might have been delayed or avoided. Within that delay, the sequence of events could have shifted in a different direction. The presence of multiple participants added further complexity. Each individual acted within their own perception of the situation, responding to immediate threat. Coordination between them, while intended at the outset, became more difficult as the conditions changed. This created a pattern where actions overlapped without full alignment, shaping the environment in ways that were not entirely predictable. Hedwig's death, in this context, reflects the interaction between familiarity and change. Her placement followed a pattern that had been consistent in earlier situations, where travel occurred under less pressure. When the conditions changed, that pattern remained, introducing a point where adjustment might have been necessary but did not occur. The difference between the familiar and the present situation became a factor in the outcome. By examining this sequence carefully, the role of small details becomes more visible. An object, a position, or a moment of recognition can influence how a larger plan unfolds. These details, while easy to overlook, carry weight when placed within a structure that depends on precision. The absence of adjustment in one area can create a path that leads toward a different result. The pattern that emerges from this event is not defined by a single failure, but by the alignment of multiple elements. The design of the plan, the response to unexpected conditions, and the presence of visible connections all contributed to the sequence that followed. Within this alignment, the difference between what occurred and what might have occurred remains narrow, shaped by points where a different choice or adjustment could have altered the path. In this way, the loss reflects a moment where protection nearly held but did not fully account for the conditions in which it was applied. The plan created distance and confusion, yet within that structure, certain elements remained exposed. When those elements were recognized, the balance shifted, allowing the sequence to move toward its outcome. Observing this progression without urgency allows the connections between these moments to become clearer. Each part of the sequence leads to the next, forming a continuous path shaped by decisions and responses. Within that path, the presence of alternative possibilities remains, showing how closely the outcome was tied to the conditions that preceded it. Alastair Moody had spent many years preparing for situations that required constant awareness. His experience as an Auror shaped the way he moved through the world, with attention placed on detail, anticipation, and the possibility that danger could appear without warning. This approach created a form of readiness that was both practical and habitual. It guided his decisions, influencing how he assessed risk and how he responded when conditions changed. Within the plan to move Harry Potter from Privet Drive, Moody's role reflected this experience. He was assigned to accompany the version of Harry that would travel with Mundungus Fletcher, positioned within a group that was expected to draw attention. This placement was not accidental. It relied on the understanding that Moody could manage a higher level of risk, using his skill to respond to threats that might arise. The structure of the plan depended on coordination between multiple groups, each following a separate route. The intention was to divide attention, creating uncertainty for those attempting to identify the real target. Within this design, each group needed to maintain its position, trusting that the others were doing the same. The effectiveness of the plan relied on this shared structure remaining intact. As the movement began, the presence of Death Eaters indicated that the plan had been compromised or anticipated. Their arrival was immediate and coordinated, suggesting prior knowledge of the timing and method of departure. This development altered the conditions significantly, reducing the advantage created by the initial design. Instead of confusion, there was direct engagement, with each group facing targeted pursuit. Moody's response to this shift followed the pattern established by his experience. He moved to protect the position he had been assigned, focusing on maintaining distance from those pursuing them. His actions were precise, shaped by years of practice in similar situations. At the same time, the environment in which he operated was less controlled than those he had encountered before. The open air, combined with multiple attackers, created a space where visibility and movement were difficult to manage fully. Mundungus Fletcher's presence introduced an element that did not align with the same level of preparation. His tendency toward uncertainty became more apparent as the attack intensified. The pressure of the situation affected his ability to remain consistent within the plan, and his eventual disappearance through apparition disrupted the structure of the group. This change occurred quickly, leaving Moody without the support that had been part of the original arrangement. The loss of coordination within the group created a new set of conditions. Moody was left to respond alone, without the alignment that had been intended. The shift from a paired structure to an individual response increased the level of risk, as it reduced the capacity to manage multiple threats simultaneously. In this moment, the plan no longer functioned as designed, and each participant acted within their own immediate circumstances. Voldemort's presence within the attack added a further layer of complexity. His focus on identifying the real Harry directed his actions towards specific targets, guided by recognition rather than uncertainty. When Harry revealed himself through the use of a particular spell, this recognition became clearer, influencing the movement of those involved. The shift in attention affected the balance of the engagement, altering how each participant was positioned within it. Moody's position, while not the primary focus at that moment, remained within the range of danger. The speed and intensity of the engagement meant that even those not directly targeted could be affected by the movement of spells. The attack that struck him occurred within this shifting environment, where the distinction between direct intention and collateral effect became less defined. His death followed immediately, leaving little space for response. The nature of the situation did not allow for recovery or intervention, as the engagement continued around that moment. Those involved were required to maintain movement, focusing on survival and the continuation of the plan, even as its structure had already begun to break apart. When viewed slowly, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to several earlier elements. The reliance on a plan that assumed limited knowledge on the part of the attackers created a condition that was vulnerable to exposure. Once that assumption was no longer valid, the plan's effectiveness decreased. A different approach, one that accounted for the possibility of prior knowledge, might have introduced additional layers of protection. The selection of participants also influenced the sequence. Pairing individuals with differing levels of readiness created an imbalance within the group. If both members had shared a similar capacity to respond under pressure, the structure might have held more consistently. The moment when Mundungus Fletcher disappeared represents a point where this imbalance became visible, altering the course of events. There were also considerations related to the environment itself. The use of open-air travel exposed each group to a wide range of threats, reducing the ability to control the conditions of movement. Alternative methods of transport, though not without their own risks, might have limited exposure in different ways. The choice of method reflects a balance between available options and the information known at the time. Timing played a role as well. The moment of departure, while chosen carefully, became known to those opposing them. The alignment between their movement and the attacker's readiness suggests that the flow of information had already shifted. Earlier recognition of this shift might have prompted a change in timing or approach, altering the conditions under which the plan was carried out. Moody's experience allowed him to respond effectively within the moment, but it could not fully compensate for the broader changes in the environment. His actions remained consistent with his role, yet the structure around him had changed in ways that reduced the impact of that consistency. This reflects the limits of individual skill when placed within a system that is no longer functioning as intended. The pattern that emerges from this sequence highlights the interaction between preparation and unpredictability. A plan, no matter how detailed, relies on certain assumptions. When those assumptions change, the plan must adapt. If it does not, the difference between expectation and reality creates a space where outcomes become less certain. Within this space, small changes can carry significant weight. The presence or absence of a single individual, the timing of a response, or the recognition of a target can influence how events unfold. These elements, while part of a larger structure, contribute to the path that leads from one moment to the next. By observing these connections carefully, the preventable aspects of the outcome become more visible. They are found in the points where awareness might have shifted, where the plan might have adapted, or where coordination might have been maintained. Each of these points represents a moment where a different choice could have influenced the direction of events. In this way, Moody's death reflects not only the intensity of the moment in which it occurred, but also the sequence that led to it. The alignment of multiple factors, each shaped by earlier decisions, created the conditions under which the outcome took form. Within that alignment, the presence of alternative possibilities remains, showing how closely the result was tied to the structure of the events that preceded it. Rufus Scrimgeour assumed leadership of the Ministry of Magic during a period when the structure it represented was already beginning to change. His approach differed from that of his predecessor, shaped by a background in direct action rather than administration alone. He recognized the presence of an active threat and adjusted the ministry's posture to reflect that awareness. Auras were deployed more visibly, and the language used to describe events became more direct, suggesting a shift toward open acknowledgement of conflict. This change, while significant, did not fully alter the underlying conditions within the ministry. Its internal structure remained divided across departments, each managing its own responsibilities with limited integration. Information continued to move through established channels, which required verification and processing before action could be taken. These procedures created a delay that persisted even as the urgency of the situation increased. Scrimgeour's position required him to balance two forms of responsibility. On one side, he needed to maintain public confidence, presenting the ministry as capable and in control. On the other, he needed to respond to threats that were not always visible or easily defined. This balance influenced how information was shared, both within the ministry and with the wider population. Certain details were emphasized, while others were held back, creating a partial view of events that did not always reflect their full scope. His interactions with Harry Potter illustrate this dynamic. Scrimgeour sought to align Harry's public image with the Ministry's position, believing that this alignment would strengthen confidence. Harry, however, was aware of conditions that were not reflected in the Ministry's portrayal. The difference between these perspectives created a tension that influenced how each approached the situation. Communication between them remained limited, shaped by differing priorities and incomplete trust. As Voldemort's influence expanded, the Ministry faced increasing pressure. Infiltration by Death Eaters and their supporters began to alter its internal environment. Decisions were influenced by individuals whose loyalties were not always clear, and the flow of information became less reliable. Within this shifting structure, Scrimgeour's ability to act was constrained, even as his awareness of the threat remained. There were moments where a more coordinated response might have been possible. Greater integration between departments, combined with more direct sharing of information, could have created a clearer understanding of the conditions within the Ministry. This understanding might have allowed for earlier identification of infiltration, reducing the extent to which it influenced decision-making. The question of transparency also played a role. Providing a more complete account of the situation to the public and to those working within the Ministry could have altered how individuals responded. Awareness of the full extent of the threat might have prompted more cautious behavior or stronger resistance. At the same time, such openness carried its own risks, potentially creating uncertainty or fear. The balance between these outcomes shaped how information was managed. Scrimgeour's refusal to yield certain information when captured reflects his commitment to the position he held. He was aware of the significance of what he knew and the consequences of revealing it. His decision to resist, even under direct pressure, aligns with the approach he had taken throughout his tenure. It represents a continuation of his effort to maintain control within conditions that were increasingly unstable. His death occurred within this context, at a point where the Ministry itself had been overtaken. The structure he had attempted to preserve was no longer functioning in the way it had been intended. Those who had infiltrated it now controlled its actions, and the flow of information had shifted entirely. In this environment, his resistance could not alter the immediate outcome. When viewed slowly, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to earlier points in the sequence. The gradual infiltration of the Ministry suggests that there were opportunities to identify and address vulnerabilities before they became fully established. Stronger internal safeguards, combined with more consistent monitoring, might have reduced the extent of this infiltration. The relationship between the Ministry and independent groups also influenced the conditions that followed. Coordination with the Order of the Phoenix and other sources of information could have provided a broader perspective on the threat. This integration might have allowed for a more unified response, reducing the isolation that characterized many of the Ministry's decisions. There were also considerations related to leadership structure. The concentration of authority within a single role placed significant responsibility on Scrimgeour, limiting the distribution of decision-making. A more distributed approach might have allowed for multiple perspectives to influence responses, increasing the likelihood that emerging threats would be recognized and addressed more quickly. Timing remains an important element within this sequence. The period between Scrimgeour's appointment and the full takeover of the Ministry was defined by gradual change rather than immediate transformation. Within this period, small adjustments could have influenced the direction of events. Earlier recognition of the pace at which conditions were shifting might have prompted more decisive action, altering the timeline of what followed. The pattern that emerges from these events reflects the interaction between authority and information. Holding a position of leadership provides the ability to act, but that ability depends on the quality and completeness of the information available. When that information is limited or disrupted, the capacity to respond effectively is reduced. Scrimgeour's actions demonstrate an awareness of this limitation. He sought to maintain control within a structure that was becoming less stable, adjusting his approach while remaining within the boundaries of his role. His efforts were consistent, yet they operated within conditions that constrained their effectiveness. By examining this sequence carefully, the presence of alternative paths becomes more visible. They are found in the moments where communication might have been expanded, where structures might have been adjusted, or where coordination might have been strengthened. These moments represent opportunities where the outcome might have shifted, though they were not fully realized. In this way, his death is connected not only to the moment in which it occurred, but to the series of decisions and conditions that led to it. The alignment of these elements created a path that became more defined over time, reducing the range of possible outcomes as it progressed. Observing this progression without urgency allows the connections between these elements to become clearer. Each decision, each limitation, and each adjustment contributes to the overall structure, shaping how events unfold. Within that structure, the presence of preventable moments remains, offering a quieter understanding of how the outcome came to be formed. Dobby's presence within the events that led to his death was shaped by loyalty that did not depend on obligation. As a house elf, he had once been bound by commands that limited his choices. Yet over time, his actions became guided by his own understanding of what needed to be done. This shift allowed him to move freely, responding to situations where others were unable to act. His involvement often occurred at moments where intervention required both speed and a willingness to accept risk. The setting that drew him into this sequence was Malfoy Manor, a place that had become closely aligned with Voldemort's influence. Those held within it were under constant watch, and the structure of the house itself was controlled in ways that limited movement and communication. Escape from such a place required more than a single action. It required a break in the pattern that maintained control, even if only for a brief moment. Harry Potter's decision to call for help created the opening through which Dobby entered the situation. The connection between them, established through earlier interactions, allowed for a response that did not depend on formal channels. Dobby's arrival was immediate, bypassing the barriers that would have prevented others from reaching the same location. This ability reflected a form of magic that operated differently from the systems used by witches and wizards, allowing him to act within spaces that were otherwise restricted. Once present, his focus remained on removing those held within the manor. The process of escape required coordination, as multiple individuals needed to be moved from one place to another in a controlled sequence. Each action depended on the previous one, creating a chain that had to remain unbroken. Within this chain, timing became central. Any delay or interruption could alter the outcome, as the conditions of the environment did not remain constant. The movement from the cellar to the outside space marked a transition from confinement to exposure. Within the cellar, the risk was defined by containment and control. Outside, the risk shifted to visibility and pursuit. The change in environment did not remove danger, but transformed it, requiring a different form of awareness. Dobby continued to act within this shifting context, maintaining focus on completing the escape. The moment of departure involved the use of apparition, a form of magic that allows for immediate movement between locations. For a house elf, this ability operates with fewer restrictions than it does for wizards, allowing for transport even in places where such movement might otherwise be limited. This advantage created the possibility of a successful escape, provided that the sequence remained uninterrupted. As the group moved toward this transition, Bellatrix Lestrange acted to prevent their departure. The throwing of the knife occurred within the narrow space between action and completion. It was not a prolonged engagement, but a single motion, timed to coincide with the moment of escape. The alignment of this action with the transition created a point where the outcome was determined almost immediately. Dobby completed the act of transporting the others to safety, arriving at a location that lay beyond the reach of those pursuing them. The success of this action ensured that those he sought to protect were removed from immediate danger. At the same time, the injury he sustained during the transition remained, shaping the final moments of the sequence. When viewed in isolation, This moment appears as a direct consequence of the attack that preceded it. When examined within the full sequence, it becomes connected to earlier elements that influenced how the situation developed. The decision to attempt escape in that moment, while necessary, occurred within conditions where visibility had already been established. The presence of multiple individuals moving together increased the likelihood of detection, narrowing the space in which action could occur without interruption. There were earlier points where the conditions of captivity might have been altered. Greater awareness of the manor's structure, combined with coordinated planning, might have created opportunities for escape under different circumstances. However, such planning would have required information that was not readily available, as well as time that the situation did not provide. The arrival of Dobby itself represents a moment where intervention was nearly complete in its effectiveness. His ability to bypass restrictions allowed him to reach those in need, and his actions carried the sequence to a point where safety was within reach. The outcome suggests that the difference between success and loss was not defined by the absence of effort, but by the narrowness of the margin within which that effort operated. Timing remains a central element in understanding this sequence. The alignment of the knife's trajectory with the moment of apparition created a condition where the transition could not prevent the injury. A slight difference in timing, either in the act of throwing or in the moment of departure, might have altered the outcome. These variations exist within the structure of the event, though they are not immediately visible when viewed as a single moment. The environment also influenced the sequence. The open space outside the manor allowed for direct action, reducing the barriers that might have otherwise interrupted the attack. Within a more enclosed or controlled setting, the dynamics of the moment might have been different. The choice of where and when to attempt escape, while shaped by necessity, contributed to the conditions under which the final action occurred. Dobby's actions reflect a pattern of intervention that carries both success and cost. His ability to act where others could not created the opportunity for escape, while the conditions surrounding that action introduced risk that could not be fully removed. The presence of this balance suggests that the sequence was shaped by both capability and limitation, each influencing the outcome in different ways. By examining these events slowly, the role of proximity becomes more apparent. The difference between safety and loss existed within a very small space, defined by the alignment of movement and response. This proximity does not diminish the significance of the actions taken, but it highlights how closely the outcome was tied to the precise conditions of the moment. The pattern that emerges from this sequence reflects the interaction between intention and environment. The intention to protect and to remove others from danger guided each action, while the environment introduced variables that could not be fully controlled. Within this interaction, the outcome was shaped by how these elements aligned at a specific point in time. There are moments within this sequence where the path might have shifted. Earlier recognition of the need to escape, combined with a different approach to movement, might have altered the timing of the final action. Additional support or coordination could have changed how the escape was carried out, influencing the conditions under which it occurred. These possibilities remain part of the structure, existing alongside the events as they unfolded. In this way, Dobby's death can be understood as part of a sequence where protection was nearly complete. The actions taken achieved their primary purpose, yet within the final moment, the alignment of timing and environment created a different result. Observing this progression allows the connections between these elements to become clearer, showing how the outcome was shaped by the narrow space between intention and completion. The Malfoy family moved through the Second Wizarding War in a position that was close to power, yet not entirely secure within it. Their connection to Voldemort placed them within his circle, giving them proximity to decisions and events that shaped the wider conflict. At the same time, this proximity did not guarantee safety. It required continued alignment with expectations that were not always stable, and it exposed them to consequences that extended beyond their control. Lucius Malfoy's earlier actions had established this position. His loyalty, expressed through support and participation, brought him into a role where he was expected to act in accordance with Voldemort's aims. This alignment carried both influence and risk. When events did not proceed as expected, the responsibility for those outcomes did not remain separate from his position. The period following Voldemort's return introduced a shift in this dynamic. Failures, whether direct or indirect, began to affect Lucius's standing. His influence diminished, and the expectations placed upon his family increased. This shift created a condition where their position became less certain. Even as their proximity to power remained unchanged, the balance between security and exposure began to narrow. Draco Malfoy's role reflects this change. Assigned a task that required action beyond his experience, he was placed in a position where success was expected without clear guidance on how to achieve it. The task itself carried significant weight, and the consequences of failure were understood without being fully stated. This understanding shaped his actions, introducing hesitation alongside effort. His attempts to complete the task involved indirect methods, each carrying risk not only to the intended target, but to others as well. These methods suggest a reluctance to act directly, combined with the pressure to produce a result. Within this pattern, there were moments where the outcome might have shifted toward unintended consequences. The objects he used and the conditions he created had the potential to cause harm beyond their intended scope. At Hogwarts, these actions unfolded within an environment that was designed for learning rather than conflict. The presence of such activity within this space reflects the extent to which external conditions had begun to influence internal structures. The school's protections, while still present, were not fully aligned with the new form of risk that had entered it. This created points where harm might have occurred without immediate intervention. Narcissa Malfoy's position within this sequence introduces a different perspective. Her actions were shaped by concern for her family, particularly for her son. This concern led her to seek assurance outside the structure that had defined their earlier alignment. Her approach to Severus Snape represents a moment where loyalty shifted toward preservation, even as outward appearances remained unchanged. The vow made in that moment created a connection that extended beyond intention into obligation. It introduced a layer of certainty within an otherwise uncertain situation, ensuring that the task assigned to Draco would be completed if he could not carry it out himself. This arrangement altered the structure of the sequence, providing an alternative path that did not depend solely on Draco's actions. Within Malfoy Manor, the family's position became more visible as the war progressed. The house itself served as a gathering place for those aligned with Voldemort, bringing the conflict into their immediate environment. This presence increased both their proximity to power and their exposure to risk. Decisions made within the manor affected not only those who visited it, but those who lived there as well. There were moments within this environment where outcomes might have shifted. During the capture of Harry and his companions, the hesitation to confirm his identity reflects a point where the sequence could have moved in a different direction. Recognition carried consequences, and the delay in providing it introduced uncertainty. This hesitation suggests an awareness of the implications of each action, even within a structure that expected alignment. The events that followed, including the escape facilitated by Dobby, altered the immediate conditions within the manor. The loss of control over the situation reduced the certainty that had defined earlier moments. This change did not remove the risks faced by the Malfoy family, but it shifted the context in which those risks existed. Their position within the structure became less defined as the balance between loyalty and self-preservation continued to change. During the final stages of the conflict, their actions reflected a movement away from direct participation. Within the Battle of Hogwarts, their focus was not on contributing to the outcome, but on maintaining their own safety. This shift suggests a gradual realignment, where earlier expectations no longer held the same influence. The presence of this change indicates that their position was not fixed, but responsive to the conditions around them. When viewed in sequence, The Malfoy family's experience reveals multiple points where outcomes might have led to loss. Draco's task, if completed directly, would have resulted in a different form of consequence for him. His earlier attempts, if successful in unintended ways, could have caused harm to those around him. The environment within the manor, if approached differently during key moments, might have led to immediate retribution. These possibilities remain part of the structure, existing alongside the events that occurred. They highlight how closely the family's survival was tied to moments of hesitation, delay, and shifting intention. Each of these moments introduced a variation in the sequence, altering the path in subtle ways that accumulated over time. The pattern that emerges reflects the interaction between proximity to power and exposure to its consequences. Being close to decision-making did not provide complete protection. Instead, it required continuous alignment with expectations that could change without notice. Within this environment, the ability to adjust became as important as the decisions themselves. By examining these events slowly, the role of uncertainty becomes clearer. The Malfoy family moved through a series of conditions where each action carried potential outcomes that were not fully defined in advance. Their survival within this sequence suggests that small variations in timing and response played a significant role in shaping the path they followed. The preventability of loss within this context lies in the points where those variations occurred. Hesitation at one moment, restraint at another, and a shift in intention at a later stage all contributed to outcomes that might otherwise have been different. These elements do not stand apart from the events, but are part of the same sequence, influencing its direction in ways that are not immediately visible. In this way, the Malfoy family's experience illustrates how the boundary between loss and survival can be shaped by subtle changes within a larger structure. The presence of these changes, though often quiet, forms part of the broader pattern that defines how events unfold within the wizarding world. The Battle of Hogwarts formed within a structure that combined preparation and uncertainty. As those aligned against Voldemort gathered within the castle, efforts were made to organize defense, to establish positions, and to create a sense of order within an environment that was about to change. Professors, members of the Order of the Phoenix, and others who chose to remain worked together to strengthen the school's protections. Charms were reinforced, barriers were placed, and the grounds were adjusted to slow any approach from outside. Students were given the option to leave, and many did. This decision reduced the number of individuals exposed to the coming conflict, yet it did not remove all risk. Some remained, either through choice or circumstance, bringing varying levels of experience into a situation that required consistent awareness. The presence of those with limited training added a layer of complexity to the defensive structure, as it introduced differences in how individuals could respond under pressure. The castle itself, while familiar, became a space that needed to be reinterpreted. Corridors, classrooms, and staircases were no longer defined by routine movement, but by their potential as defensive positions or points of vulnerability. This shift required those present to adjust their understanding quickly, aligning their actions with conditions that were no longer stable. In this environment, coordination depended on both knowledge of the space and the ability to respond to changes as they occurred. As the battle began, the structure that had been established encountered immediate strain. Voldemort's forces approached with coordination, testing the defenses that had been put in place. Spells were exchanged across distances, and the barriers surrounding the castle began to weaken under repeated pressure. Each impact altered the conditions slightly, reducing the effectiveness of the protections over time. Within the castle, movement became less predictable. Individuals shifted positions in response to threats, forming and reforming lines of defense as needed. Communication between these groups was limited, often reduced to brief exchanges or signals that carried only immediate information. This created a pattern where each group acted within its own understanding of the situation, without a complete view of how other areas were changing. The presence of multiple entry points increased the difficulty of maintaining control. As barriers weakened, the possibility of infiltration grew. Defenders were required to monitor several areas at once, dividing their attention across spaces that could not all be observed simultaneously. This division introduced gaps, where movement could occur without immediate detection. The involvement of different forms of magic added further complexity. Protective spells, offensive curses, and environmental effects interacted in ways that were not always predictable. The structure of the castle itself responded to these interactions, with parts of it shifting or collapsing under the strain. These changes altered the physical environment, creating new paths while closing others. There were moments within the battle where coordination came close to stabilizing conditions. Groups aligned their actions, reinforcing positions and responding to immediate threats with shared intent. These moments, while effective, were often brief. The ongoing pressure from outside forces required constant adjustment, preventing any single structure from holding for an extended period. The presence of Voldemort himself influenced the flow of the battle. His actions, combined with those of his closest followers, directed attention towards specific areas. This focus created points of intensity, where the concentration of force was greater. Those within these areas faced conditions that differed from the rest of the battlefield, requiring rapid responses to immediate danger. Within this shifting environment, the line between defense and exposure became less clear. Positions that had been secure moments before could become vulnerable as conditions changed. Individuals moved through these spaces, adapting to what was in front of them, without always knowing how the broader situation had evolved. This limited awareness shaped decisions, guiding actions that were appropriate in the moment but not always aligned with the larger structure. There were points where earlier planning might have altered these conditions. Greater emphasis on evacuation could have reduced the number of individuals present during the most intense phases of the battle. Additional layers of defense, placed in depth rather than at a single boundary, might have slowed the progression of external forces. Improved communication systems could have allowed for more coordinated responses, aligning actions across different areas of the castle. At the same time, the nature of the conflict placed limits on what could be achieved through planning alone. The presence of powerful magic, combined with the variability of individual actions, meant that no structure could account for every possibility. The difference between what was planned and what occurred reflects the gap between expectation and reality, a gap that became more visible as the battle progressed. As the conflict continued, fatigue began to influence actions. The sustained effort required to maintain defense reduced the capacity for precise responses. Small errors became more likely, and the ability to adapt quickly diminished over time. This change did not occur suddenly, but developed gradually, affecting how individuals moved and responded within the environment. Within this progression, there were moments where the outcome of specific encounters might have been different. A shift in position, a delay in movement, or a different choice of action could alter the immediate result. These variations, while small, contributed to the overall pattern of the battle, shaping how it unfolded across multiple locations at once. The pattern that emerges from this sequence reflects the interaction between structure and change. The initial defenses provided a framework, but the conditions of the battle required continuous adjustment. Each change influenced the next, creating a flow that moved beyond the original design. Within this flow, opportunities for prevention existed, though they were often difficult to recognize in the moment. By observing these events slowly, the presence of these opportunities becomes clearer. They are found in the points where coordination might have been strengthened, where movement might have been adjusted, or where awareness might have been expanded. These points do not stand apart from the battle, but are part of the same sequence, influencing its direction in subtle ways. The Battle of Hogwarts, in this context, can be understood as a convergence of many smaller sequences, each shaped by its own conditions and decisions. Within these sequences, the difference between what occurred and what might have occurred remains narrow, defined by moments where alignment was nearly achieved but did not fully hold. In this way, the losses that occurred within the battle are connected not only to the intensity of the conflict, but to the structure that supported it. The interaction between preparation, communication, and response created conditions where certain outcomes became more likely. Within those conditions, the presence of alternative possibilities remains, offering a quieter understanding of how the events came to be shaped. Within the Battle of Hogwarts, movement through the castle created a pattern that was both familiar and altered at the same time. Corridors that had once carried ordinary passage now held shifting lines of defense. Those moving through them relied on their knowledge of the space, yet that knowledge was constantly being adjusted by the effects of the battle. Walls were damaged, ceilings weakened, and the structure itself responded to the force placed upon it. In this environment, the difference between a stable position and a vulnerable one could change without warning. Fred Weasley remained within this shifting space, positioned alongside others who were working to maintain control over sections of the castle. His presence reflected a decision to remain engaged, to act within the defense rather than withdraw from it. This decision aligned with the broader pattern of those who stayed, where individual choice contributed to the overall structure of resistance. Each person added to the capacity of the group, yet also increased the number of individuals exposed to risk. The corridor in which he stood became a point where movement and force intersected. Spells passed through the space, directed toward opponents whose positions were not always fully visible. The exchange created a constant adjustment of position as those present responded to immediate threats. Each action depended on the previous one, and the space between actions carried weight that was not always apparent. The structure of the castle in that area had already begun to weaken. Earlier impacts had reduced its stability, creating conditions where additional force could produce a different effect than intended. This change was gradual, not immediately visible to those moving through the corridor. It existed as a background condition, shaping how the space would respond to further strain. The moment that led to Fred's death occurred within this context. An explosion resulting from the interaction of spells and structural weakness altered the corridor suddenly. The force of it moved through the space, affecting those present without distinction. The collapse that followed did not target a specific individual, but occurred as a result of the conditions that had developed over time. Fred's position at that moment placed him within the path of this change. The alignment of his movement with the timing of the explosion created a point where the outcome was immediate. There was no interval in which adjustment could be made, as the shift from stability to collapse happened at once. Those nearby were affected differently depending on their position, reflecting the uneven nature of the force within the space. When viewed in isolation, the event appears as a sudden outcome of the battle's intensity. When examined within the broader sequence, it becomes connected to earlier elements that shaped the conditions of the corridor. The weakening of the structure, the accumulation of force within the space, and the timing of movement all contributed to the moment when the collapse occurred. There were points within this sequence where the conditions might have been altered. Earlier recognition of structural instability could have led to a shift in positioning, moving individuals away from areas at higher risk. Greater coordination in directing movement through the castle might have reduced exposure in spaces that had already been weakened. These adjustments would not have removed all risk, but they might have changed how it was distributed. The presence of multiple individuals within the corridor also influenced the sequence. Their combined actions created a pattern of movement that was responsive rather than fixed. While this allowed for flexibility, it also introduced variability. Each movement affected the next, creating a chain where small differences could alter the overall pattern. Within this chain, the timing of the explosion intersected with Fred's position in a way that defined the outcome. Communication within this environment was limited. The noise and movement of the battle reduced the ability to share detailed information about conditions in different parts of the castle. Without this information, decisions were made based on what could be seen or inferred in the immediate area. This localized awareness, while necessary, did not always reflect the full extent of structural changes occurring elsewhere. The pattern that emerges from this sequence reflects the interaction between environment and action. The castle, shaped by earlier impacts, responded differently than it would have under stable conditions. Actions taken within that environment carried consequences that extended beyond their immediate intent, influencing how the space changed over time. Fred's death, in this context, is connected to the alignment of these elements. His presence within the corridor, the timing of the explosion, and the condition of the structure all combined within a single moment. The closeness of alternative possibilities becomes visible when considering how slight variations might have altered this alignment. A different position, a delayed movement, or a change in the sequence of actions could have led to a different result. These variations are not separate from the event, but part of its structure. They exist as points where the path might have shifted, though it did not. The difference between what occurred and what might have occurred is defined by these points, where the outcome remained open until the moment it was set. By examining this progression slowly, the role of cumulative change becomes clearer. Each action contributed to this condition, even if its effect was not immediately visible. Over time, these contributions combined to create a space that responded differently to further force. The presence of this cumulative change highlights how preventable outcomes can be shaped by earlier events that are not directly connected in an obvious way. The actions that weakened the structure were not aimed at creating the final collapse, yet they formed part of the sequence that allowed it to occur. This connection between earlier and later moments defines the pattern through which the outcome emerged. In this way, the loss reflects a point where the environment and the actions within it aligned in a specific way. The battle created conditions that were constantly changing, and within those changes, certain outcomes became more likely. Observing these conditions without urgency allows the connections between them to become clearer, showing how closely the moment was tied to the sequence that preceded it. The pattern remains quiet, existing beneath the movement of the battle. It does not draw attention to itself in the moment, but becomes visible when the events are held in place and considered together. Within that pattern, the presence of alternative paths can be seen, offering a different perspective on how the outcome came to be formed. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks entered the final stages of the conflict with an understanding that had been shaped by earlier events. Their roles within the Order of the Phoenix placed them in positions where participation was expected, yet their personal circumstances had changed. They now shared responsibility for a child, a new presence that connected them to a future beyond the immediate conditions of the war. This change did not remove their connection to the conflict, but it introduced an additional layer to the decisions they would make. The choice to join the Battle of Hogwarts reflected a continuation of their earlier commitments. It aligned with the pattern of those who remained to defend the castle, where individual decisions contributed to the collective structure of resistance. At the same time, this choice carried weight beyond the immediate environment. It extended into considerations that were not visible within the battle itself, shaping the significance of their presence in ways that were not directly expressed. Within the castle, movement during the battle followed a pattern that was both organized and fluid. Groups formed and shifted as conditions changed, responding to threats that appeared across multiple areas. Lupin and Tonks moved within this structure, their actions guided by experience and the need to adapt to the environment around them. Each moment required attention to immediate conditions, leaving little space for reflection beyond the task at hand. Their positions within the battle are not described in detail, yet their deaths are known to have occurred within its broader progression. This absence of specific description creates a different kind of understanding, one that focuses less on the exact moment and more on the conditions that led to it. Within these conditions, the interaction between presence and risk becomes central. The decision to remain within the battle placed them within an environment where exposure to danger was constant. Unlike earlier stages of the conflict, where actions might be more contained or controlled, the battle created a space where outcomes were influenced by multiple factors at once. Spells moved across open areas, structural changes altered the environment, and the actions of many individuals overlapped in ways that were not fully predictable. There were earlier points where different choices might have altered their presence in this environment. The decision to prioritize the safety of their child could have led to withdrawal from direct participation, placing them outside the immediate conditions of the battle. This alternative would not have removed all risk from their lives, but it would have changed the context in which that risk existed. At the same time, the nature of their roles influenced how such decisions were made. Their identities were shaped by participation, by a sense of responsibility that extended beyond personal circumstances. This sense of responsibility does not function as a fixed rule, but as a guiding influence that shapes how options are perceived. Within this influence, remaining within the battle may have appeared as the most consistent choice, even as it carried additional risk. The structure of the battle itself also contributed to the conditions that followed. The distribution of defenders across the castle created areas where support was limited, increasing the reliance on those present in each location. This distribution meant that individuals were often required to respond without immediate reinforcement, acting within the limits of what was available to them at that moment. Communication within the battle remained constrained. Information moved in fragments, carried through brief exchanges rather than complete descriptions. This limited awareness shaped how individuals positioned themselves, as decisions were based on what could be seen or inferred locally. Without a full understanding of conditions elsewhere, the ability to adjust to broader changes was reduced. The presence of multiple threats further influenced the sequence. Opponents moved through the castle with their own objectives, creating points of contact that were not always anticipated. Within these encounters, the outcome depended on the alignment of movement, timing, and response. Small variations within these elements could alter the direction of events, shaping the results in ways that were not immediately visible. Lupin and Tonks, moving within this environment, were subject to the same conditions as others present. Their experience provided a measure of awareness, yet it could not remove the variability introduced by the broader context. The moment of their deaths, though not described in detail, can be understood as occurring within this pattern, where multiple factors converge to produce a specific outcome. When viewed slowly, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to the earlier decision to remain within the battle. This decision placed them within a sequence where risk was continuous and difficult to manage fully. A different choice at that point would have altered the sequence entirely, removing them from the immediate conditions that led to their death. There were also considerations related to coordination and support. Greater alignment between those present within the castle might have reduced the isolation of certain positions, allowing for more effective response to emerging threats. Improved communication could have provided clearer awareness of changing conditions, influencing how individuals moved and where they positioned themselves. The environment itself introduced variables that were not fully controllable. Structural changes, combined with the movement of spells, created a landscape that shifted continuously. Within this landscape, even experienced individuals faced limitations in how much they could anticipate or adjust. These limitations form part of the structure that defines how the battle unfolded. The pattern that emerges reflects the interaction between personal decision and external condition. The choice to remain within the battle, combined with the nature of the environment, created a path where the outcome was shaped by both intention and circumstance. Each element influenced the next, forming a sequence that moved forward without pause. By examining this sequence carefully, the presence of alternative paths becomes more visible. They are found in the moments where decisions might have been different, where coordination might have been stronger, or where awareness might have been more complete. These paths do not stand apart from the events, but exist alongside them, indicating how the outcome might have shifted under different conditions. In this way, their deaths can be understood as part of a broader pattern within the battle, where the convergence of multiple factors created outcomes that were not entirely fixed in advance. The difference between what occurred and what might have occurred remains narrow, defined by the points where small changes could have altered the direction of events. Observing this progression without urgency allows the connections between these elements to become clearer. The interaction between choice, environment, and timing forms a structure that shapes how events unfold. Within that structure, the presence of preventable moments remains, offering a quieter understanding of how the sequence came to its conclusion. Colin Creevy's presence at the Battle of Hogwarts formed from a decision that existed slightly outside the structure that had been set in place. When students were given the option to leave, the intention was to reduce exposure to danger, to limit the number of individuals within the castle who might be affected by the conditions of the conflict. This process relied on a clear separation between those who would remain and those who would depart. It assumed that the boundary would hold, and that movement across it would be limited. Colin's decision did not fully align with this structure. As a younger student, he was not expected to remain. His earlier experiences at Hogwarts had been shaped by observation and enthusiasm, often directed toward moments that held personal significance. This tendency to move toward what he valued did not diminish as the conditions changed. Instead, it influenced how he interpreted the situation, leading him to return even after the opportunity to leave had been provided. His return placed him within an environment that was not prepared for his presence. The defensive structure of the castle had been organized with certain expectations regarding who would be involved. These expectations influenced how positions were assigned, how responsibilities were distributed, and how risks were managed. The inclusion of someone outside these expectations introduced a variable that was not fully accounted for within the plan. Within the castle, the movement of individuals followed patterns that were shaped by both familiarity and necessity. Those with experience positioned themselves in areas where they could respond effectively, while others followed guidance that directed them to safer locations. Colin's movement did not fully align with these patterns. Without a defined role, his position was determined by immediate circumstances rather than by a coordinated plan. This difference in positioning affected how he encountered the conditions of the battle. Exposure to danger was not evenly distributed across the castle. Certain areas carried higher levels of risk, influenced by their proximity to points of entry or by the intensity of activity within them. Without guidance that directed him away from these areas, Colin's movement placed him within spaces where the conditions were less controlled. The nature of the battle introduced further complexity. Spells moved across open and enclosed spaces, and the structure of the castle shifted under their influence. Visibility was often limited, and the ability to anticipate the direction of threat was reduced. Within this environment, experience provided a measure of awareness. Yet even those with training faced uncertainty. For someone without that experience, the ability to interpret conditions was further constrained. There were earlier points where the sequence might have shifted. The process of evacuation, if enforced more strictly, could have reduced the likelihood of his return. Additional monitoring of those leaving might have ensured that the boundary between safety and exposure remained intact. These measures would not have altered the nature of the battle itself, but they could have changed who was present within it. Communication also played a role. The clarity of instruction during the evacuation influenced how individuals understood their options. If the reasons for leaving had been expressed with greater emphasis on the conditions that would follow, the decision to return might have been viewed differently. At the same time, communication during the battle remained limited, reducing the ability to guide movement once it had begun. Within the castle, opportunities for guidance were constrained by the demands placed on those responsible for defense. Attention was directed toward immediate threats, leaving less capacity to monitor the movement of individuals whose presence was unexpected. This created a condition where Colin's position was shaped by circumstance rather than by coordination. The moment of his death occurred within this broader pattern. While the specific details are not fully described, it can be understood as the result of exposure to conditions that were not intended for someone in his position. The alignment of his presence with areas of higher risk created a point where the outcome became fixed within the sequence of events. When viewed slowly, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to the earlier separation between those who would remain and those who would leave. The boundary established at that point carried significance, defining the conditions under which individuals would encounter the battle. The movement across that boundary altered those conditions, placing him within a sequence that was not designed to include him. There were also considerations related to awareness and perception. Colin's decision to return reflects a perspective shaped by earlier experiences, where proximity to significant events held value. This perspective did not fully align with the nature of the conflict he entered, where visibility carried risk rather than meaning. The difference between these perspectives influenced how he moved within the environment. The pattern that emerges from this sequence reflects the interaction between structure and individual choice. The system established to manage risk provided a framework, yet its effectiveness depended on alignment with that framework. When individuals moved outside of it, the distribution of risk changed, creating conditions that were not fully anticipated. By examining these elements carefully, the role of boundaries becomes more apparent. The distinction between safe and unsafe spaces, between participation and withdrawal, carries weight within a conflict. Maintaining these boundaries requires not only initial instruction, but ongoing reinforcement and awareness. When this maintenance is limited, the boundaries become permeable, allowing movement that alters the conditions within them. The presence of alternative possibilities remains within this sequence. They are found in the moments where the boundary might have held more firmly, where communication might have been clearer, or where guidance might have been more consistent. These possibilities do not exist separately from the events, but are part of the same structure, indicating how the outcome might have been different. In this way, Colin Creevy's death can be understood as part of a pattern where the alignment between system and action did not fully hold. The framework for safety was present, yet its application was incomplete. Within this space, the difference between intention and outcome became more visible, shaped by the interaction between individual movement and the conditions of the environment. Observing this progression without urgency allows the connections between these elements to become clearer. The sequence does not rest on a single moment, but on the accumulation of smaller decisions and conditions that led to that moment. Within this accumulation, the presence of preventable points remains, offering a quieter understanding of how the outcome came to be formed. Lavender Brown's presence within the final stages of the battle reflects a position that was close to the line between participation and vulnerability. As a student, her experience of conflict had been shaped by events that unfolded within the structure of Hogwarts, where danger appeared in moments but was often contained within a larger sense of safety. The shift from these earlier conditions to the sustained intensity of the battle introduced a different environment, one where the distinction between controlled and uncontrolled space became less clear. Her decision to remain within the castle aligned with that of others who chose to stay, contributing to the collective effort to resist the advancing threat. This choice placed her within a structure that depended on coordination between individuals of varying levels of experience. While some were accustomed to direct engagement, others moved within the battle with a more limited understanding of how to respond to rapidly changing conditions. The presence of both groups created a pattern where positions were held and adjusted based on immediate necessity rather than long-established roles. Within this environment, movement through the castle became a central aspect of how individuals encountered risk. Corridors, rooms, and open spaces each carried different levels of exposure, influenced by their proximity to points of entry and by the concentration of activity within them. These spaces did not remain constant. As the battle progressed, spells and structural changes altered their character, creating new paths while closing others. This continuous adjustment required those present to rely on both awareness and instinct. Lavender's position within this shifting landscape placed her in areas where the conditions were less controlled. Without a clearly defined role, her movement was shaped by the flow of those around her, aligning with groups that formed and dispersed in response to immediate threats. This pattern created moments where proximity to danger increased without a corresponding increase in protection. The encounter with Fenrir Greyback occurred within this broader context. Greyback's presence within the battle introduced a different form of threat, one that combined physical force with the potential for transformation. His movements were less predictable, guided by instinct as much as by strategy. This difference altered how encounters with him unfolded, as the usual patterns of spell-based engagement did not fully apply. The moment of contact between them represents a point where the sequence of events became more defined. Lavender's position, combined with the timing of Greyback's movement, created a condition where the outcome was shaped quickly. The attack that followed did not exist within a prolonged exchange, but occurred within a brief alignment of movement and proximity. This alignment reduced the space available for response, limiting the ability to alter the course of the event once it had begun. Following this moment, her condition remained uncertain. Accounts suggest that she was left on the edge of survival, with the immediate outcome not fully determined. This uncertainty reflects the nature of the encounter, where the effects of the attack were not entirely fixed in the moment they occurred. The possibility of recovery remained, dependent on the actions taken afterward and the conditions within which those actions occurred. The response to her injury was shaped by the broader environment of the battle. Medical attention, while present within the castle, was distributed across multiple areas, each managing the needs of those affected within their immediate vicinity. The movement required to reach these points of care was influenced by the same conditions that shaped the rest of the battle, including blocked paths, shifting structures, and ongoing conflict. There were earlier points where the sequence might have been altered. The decision to remain within the castle, while aligned with the collective effort, placed her within an environment of sustained risk. A different choice at that stage would have changed the conditions under which the later encounter occurred. Similarly, greater guidance in movement within the castle might have directed her away from areas where exposure to such threats was higher. The presence of individuals like Greyback within the battle also reflects broader considerations. His inclusion among Voldemort's forces introduced a form of risk that differed from other participants. Awareness of his movements and tendencies might have influenced how positions were assigned and how individuals were guided within the castle. This awareness, if more widely distributed, could have contributed to adjustments in how exposure was managed. Timing remains a central element in understanding this sequence. The alignment of Lavender's position with Greyback's movement occurred within a narrow interval, where a slight difference in either element might have altered the outcome. These variations exist within the structure of the event, though they are not immediately visible when viewed as a single moment. The pattern that emerges reflects the interaction between environment, movement, and awareness. The battle created conditions where individuals encountered risk based on how these elements aligned at specific points in time. Within this pattern, the difference between safety and harm often existed within small variations that were difficult to anticipate. By examining these events slowly, the role of uncertainty becomes more apparent. Not all outcomes are immediately defined, and some remain open to influence even after the initial moment of contact. This openness suggests that the sequence does not end at the point of injury, but continues through the responses that follow. The preventability of the outcome, then, lies not only in the moment of the attack, but in the earlier conditions that shaped how that moment occurred. The decision to remain, the movement through the castle, and the distribution of awareness all contributed to the path that led to that point. Within this path, there were opportunities where different choices or adjustments might have altered the direction of events. These opportunities remain part of the structure, existing alongside the events as they unfolded. They highlight how closely the outcome was tied to the alignment of multiple factors, each influencing the sequence in its own way. The presence of these factors suggests that the boundary between survival and loss was not fixed, but shaped by the interaction between them. In this way, Lavender Brown's experience reflects a pattern where the edge of survival is defined by the conditions surrounding it. The difference between what occurred and what might have occurred remains narrow, shaped by moments where small changes could have shifted the balance. Observing this progression allows the connections between these elements to become clearer, offering a quieter understanding of how the sequence came to be formed. Vincent Crabbe's final actions occurred within a space that was already defined by accumulation. The room of requirement, when used in the way it was during that moment, held objects that had been hidden over many years. These objects formed shifting corridors and uneven surfaces, creating an environment that was not stable in a conventional sense. Movement within it required attention to both direction and footing, as the arrangement of the space did not follow a fixed pattern. The purpose that brought Crabbe into the room was connected to pursuit. Alongside Draco Malfoy and Gregory Goyle, he moved through the space with the intention of locating Harry Potter. This pursuit was influenced by the broader conditions of the battle, where objectives were often shaped by immediate pressure rather than extended planning. Within this context, actions tended to become more direct, with less emphasis on the potential consequences beyond the immediate goal. Crabbe's use of Fiendfire introduced a different element into the environment. The spell itself is known for its complexity and its lack of containment once cast. It does not respond easily to control, and its effects extend beyond the initial intention of the person who invokes it. The decision to use it within a confined and unstable space created a condition where the environment would respond in ways that could not be fully predicted. At the moment the spell was cast, its form began to develop rapidly. The fire did not move as a simple flame, but took on shapes that carried direction and force. These shapes expanded through the room, consuming objects and altering the structure as they moved. The surfaces that had previously supported movement were transformed, creating new hazards within a space that was already difficult to navigate. The initial purpose of the spell was to drive others out of the room, to create pressure that would force movement. This intention did not account for the scale of the effect that followed. As the fire expanded, it began to fill the space, reducing the available paths for escape. The environment shifted from one that allowed movement in multiple directions to one where those directions were steadily removed. Crabbe's position within this sequence became increasingly limited. The expansion of the fire altered the paths that had been available moments before. The instability of the objects within the room, combined with the movement of the flames, created a pattern where footing and direction could not be maintained consistently. Each attempt to move required adjustment, and each adjustment was influenced by changes that were occurring simultaneously. There were earlier points where the use of Fiendfire might have been reconsidered. The knowledge associated with the spell includes an understanding of its risks, particularly in enclosed spaces. This knowledge is not always applied in moments of urgency, where immediate objectives can take precedence over longer-term considerations. The decision to use it reflects this shift in focus, where the desire to achieve a result outweighed the need to manage its effects. The presence of others within the room also influenced the sequence. Their movement created additional variables, as each person responded to the changing conditions in their own way. Coordination between them was limited, as the environment did not allow for clear communication. This lack of alignment contributed to the difficulty of navigating the space once the fire had begun to spread. As the flames intensified, the possibility of controlling them diminished. Fiendfire does not allow for simple reversal, and without the knowledge or ability to contain it, the fire continued to expand. This progression created a narrowing space where escape became increasingly difficult. The difference between a clear path and an obstructed one was defined by the movement of the flames, which changed continuously. Crabbe's attempt to navigate this environment occurred within this narrowing space. His position, combined with the timing of the fire's expansion, created a point where the available paths were no longer sufficient to allow escape. The outcome was determined not by a single action, but by the accumulation of conditions that had developed since the spell was cast. When viewed slowly, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to the decision to use the spell in that context. Alternative approaches to the situation, including the use of less destructive magic or a different form of engagement, might have avoided the conditions that led to the final result. These alternatives were present within the structure of the moment, though they were not chosen. The environment itself also contributed to the sequence. The room of requirement, in its current form, was not suited to containing such a force. Its shifting structure, combined with the density of objects within it, created a setting where the fire could spread rapidly. A different location or a different use of the room might have altered how the spell behaved. There were also considerations related to knowledge and preparation. The use of advanced magic requires an understanding of its effects, particularly when those effects extend beyond immediate control. The absence of this understanding, or the decision not to apply it, creates a gap between intention and outcome. Within this gap, the conditions for unintended consequences emerge. Timing remains a central element in understanding the sequence. The moment at which the fire reached a critical point, combined with Crabbe's position at that time, defined the outcome. A slight difference in timing, either in the casting of the spell or in the movement that followed, might have altered the alignment of these elements. The pattern that emerges reflects the interaction between action and environment. The introduction of Fiendfire changed the nature of the space, and the response to that change was shaped by the limitations of movement within it. Each element influenced the next, creating a progression that moved toward a fixed outcome. By examining these events carefully, the role of escalation becomes more visible. The initial action increased the level of risk within the environment, and each subsequent moment reflected that increase. The absence of a mechanism to reduce or contain the risk allowed it to continue, shaping the sequence until it reached its conclusion. The preventability of the outcome lies within the earlier moments where different choices might have been made. The decision to use a less destructive approach, the application of knowledge regarding the spell, or the selection of a different environment, all represent points where the path could have shifted. These points remain part of the structure, existing alongside the events as they occurred. In this way, Vincent Crabbe's death can be understood as part of a sequence where the introduction of an uncontrollable element defined the conditions that followed. The difference between what occurred and what might have occurred remains narrow, shaped by the alignment of decisions and responses within a changing environment. Observing this progression allows the connections between these elements to become clearer, offering a quieter understanding of how the outcome came to be formed. Bellatrix Lestrange moved through the conflict with a consistency that was shaped by certainty in her own actions. Her alignment with Voldemort was not only a matter of loyalty, but of identity. This alignment influenced how she approached every encounter, creating a pattern where her responses were direct and often unrestrained. Within this pattern, there was little space for hesitation, and this absence of hesitation contributed to the intensity of her presence in any engagement. During the Battle of Hogwarts, her movements reflected this same approach. She positioned herself within areas where the conflict was most active, engaging opponents without withdrawing from the conditions around her. This placed her within a sequence where the accumulation of encounters influenced the progression of events. Each engagement carried forward into the next, creating a continuous flow that was difficult to interrupt. The duel that led to her death occurred within this broader environment. Molly Weasley's presence in that moment was defined by proximity to those she sought to protect. The interaction between them did not arise in isolation, but as a result of the movement and positioning that had developed within the battle. Their paths intersected at a point where both were fully engaged, and the conditions of the surrounding space shaped how the encounter unfolded. Bellatrix's approach to the duel remained consistent with her earlier actions. She advanced with confidence, relying on her ability to act quickly and decisively. This confidence had been reinforced through previous encounters, where her methods had proven effective. Within this pattern, the expectation of success became part of how she interpreted each new situation. Molly Weasley's response, while less visible in earlier stages of the conflict, carried its own form of certainty. Her actions in that moment were guided by immediate necessity, focused on preventing harm within a space that had become unstable. This focus influenced how she moved and how she directed her attention, creating a contrast with Bellatrix's approach. The environment in which they faced each other was not static. The ongoing battle affected the space around them, altering conditions in ways that were not always predictable. Movement in nearby areas, the impact of spells, and the structure of the castle itself all contributed to a setting that required constant adjustment. Within this setting, each participant needed to respond not only to their opponent, but to the changes occurring around them. The moment that determined the outcome developed within this shifting context. Bellatrix's focus on her opponent did not fully account for the variability introduced by the environment and by the nature of Molly's response. The alignment of their actions reached a point where a single spell altered the sequence. The effect of that spell was immediate, bringing the encounter to its conclusion without a prolonged exchange. When viewed slowly, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to earlier elements within the sequence. Bellatrix's approach, while effective in many situations, relied on a consistent pattern that did not adjust significantly in response to changing conditions. This reliance reduced the flexibility of her actions, making it more difficult to adapt when the environment or the nature of her opponent differed from previous encounters. There were points within the duel where variation might have altered the outcome. A shift in positioning, a change in timing, or a different interpretation of the conditions around her could have influenced how the encounter progressed. These variations exist within the structure of the moment, though they are not immediately visible when viewed as a single event. The broader environment of the battle also contributed to the conditions that shaped the duel. The intensity of the conflict created a setting where multiple factors influenced each engagement. Awareness of these factors, combined with the ability to adjust in response to them, affected how individuals moved within the space. Where this awareness was limited, the ability to respond effectively was reduced. Bellatrix's earlier experiences had reinforced a particular approach, one that emphasized direct engagement and confidence in her own abilities. This approach did not fully account for situations where those abilities might be matched or where the environment introduced additional variables. The continuation of this pattern into the final encounter suggests a consistency that did not adapt to the changing conditions of the battle. Molly Weasley's presence within the sequence reflects a different form of response, one shaped by immediate necessity rather than by established pattern. This difference influenced how the encounter developed, creating a contrast that became significant within the final moment. The alignment of these two approaches, within a shifting environment, defined the outcome. There are earlier points within the broader sequence where the conditions might have been different. Changes in positioning within the battle, variations in how individuals were distributed across the castle, or shifts in the timing of encounters could have altered when and how their paths crossed. These elements, while separate from the duel itself, form part of the structure that led to it. The pattern that emerges reflects the interaction between consistency and adaptation. Bellatrix's actions followed a consistent approach, while the conditions around her required continuous adjustment. Where these two elements did not align, the sequence moved toward a different outcome than might have been expected based on earlier encounters. By examining these events carefully, the role of perception becomes more visible. The way a situation is understood influences how it is approached. When perception is shaped by past experience without adjustment for present conditions, it can limit the range of possible responses. This limitation becomes more significant in environments that are constantly changing. The preventability of the outcome lies within the points where adaptation might have occurred, recognizing the difference between earlier conditions and the present moment, adjusting actions in response to that recognition, and allowing for variability within the environment, all represent ways in which the sequence might have shifted. These points remain part of the structure, existing alongside the events as they unfolded. In this way, Bellatrix Lestrange's death can be understood as part of a sequence where the alignment between approach and environment did not fully hold. The consistency of her actions, while effective in many contexts, did not adjust to the specific conditions of the encounter. Within this difference, the outcome took form, shaped by the interaction between what was expected and what was present. Observing this progression without urgency allows the connections between these elements to become clearer. Each part of the sequence contributes to the overall structure, influencing how events unfold. Within that structure, the presence of alternative possibilities remains, offering a quieter understanding of how the outcome came to be shaped. Voldemort's final actions developed within a framework that had been shaped over a long period of time. His understanding of power relied on the accumulation of objects, knowledge, and control over others. Each of these elements contributed to a structure that appeared consistent, yet depended on interpretation as much as on fact. Within this structure, the meaning assigned to certain forms of magic guided his decisions, even when those meanings were not fully aligned with how the magic itself functioned. The Elder Wand became central to this framework. Its history suggested that it carried allegiance to its master, transferring that allegiance through acts of defeat. Voldemort's interpretation of this history focused on the idea that possession of the wand, combined with the removal of its previous owner, would secure its loyalty. This interpretation guided his actions, leading him to seek control over the wand through a sequence that appeared logical within his understanding. The decision to kill Severus Snape was shaped by this reasoning. Voldemort believed that Snape's connection to Albus Dumbledore, who had possessed the wand, placed him in the position of its master. By ending Snape's life, Voldemort expected the wand's allegiance to transfer to himself. This expectation did not account for the conditions under which the wand's loyalty had actually shifted. The difference between these interpretations created a gap between intention and outcome. The wand's allegiance had already changed through a different sequence of events, one that did not align with Voldemort's understanding. Draco Malfoy had disarmed Dumbledore before Snape acted, altering the line of allegiance. Later, Harry Potter's actions toward Draco extended that line further. These transitions occurred within moments that were not fully recognized as significant at the time, yet they shaped the underlying structure of the wand's loyalty. This difference in understanding influenced how Voldemort approached the final confrontation. His confidence in the wand's power remained consistent, supported by his belief that he had secured its allegiance. Within this belief, there was little room to consider alternative explanations. The pattern of relying on his own interpretation, without adjusting for new information, continued into this final stage. The confrontation itself took place within the castle, where the conditions of the battle had already shifted. Movement had slowed, and the focus had narrowed to specific encounters. The presence of both Harry and Voldemort within the same space created a moment where the broader sequence of events converged. Each action carried weight, not only in its immediate effect, but in how it connected to the structure that had developed over time. Harry's understanding of the wand's allegiance differed from Voldemort's. This understanding did not come from a single moment, but from the accumulation of information and observation. The recognition of how the wand's loyalty functioned provided a perspective that aligned more closely with its actual behavior. Within this alignment, the difference between the two interpretations became central to the outcome. The moment of the final spell exchange reflected this difference. Voldemort acted with the expectation that the wand would respond to his command, reinforcing his intention with the force he believed he controlled. Harry's response, shaped by a different understanding, did not rely on the same assumption. Instead, it aligned with the recognition that the wand's loyalty lay elsewhere. When the spells met, the result did not follow Voldemort's expectation. The wand did not act in accordance with his intention. This reversal occurred within a brief moment, where the underlying structure of allegiance determined the outcome more than the force of the spell itself. The sequence reached its conclusion at this point, defined by the alignment between understanding and function. When viewed slowly, the preventability of this outcome becomes connected to earlier decisions. Voldemort's interpretation of the wand's allegiance was based on incomplete knowledge. A deeper examination of its history, combined with a willingness to question his assumptions, might have altered his approach. This would have required a shift in perspective, allowing for the possibility that his understanding was not complete. There were also points where the sequence of allegiance might have been recognized. The disarming of Dumbledore by Draco Malfoy and the later transfer of that connection to Harry created a chain that could have been observed. Greater attention to these moments might have revealed the actual line of allegiance, providing information that would have changed the final conditions. The decision to act without verifying this understanding reflects a pattern that had appeared earlier. Confidence in interpretation, combined with a reluctance to reconsider, shaped how Voldemort approached complex forms of magic. This pattern reduced the likelihood of identifying discrepancies between belief and reality, allowing those discrepancies to persist. The environment of the final confrontation also influenced the sequence. The focus on a single encounter, combined with the culmination of earlier events, created a space where the outcome depended on the interaction between these underlying elements. The broader battle receded, leaving the alignment between wand allegiance and understanding as the central factor. The pattern that emerges reflects the interaction between knowledge and assumption. Where knowledge is incomplete and assumption remains unchallenged, the resulting actions may not align with the actual conditions. In this case, the difference between these two elements defined the outcome, shaping the final moment in a way that could not be altered once the sequence reached that point. By examining these events carefully, the role of interpretation becomes more visible. The meaning assigned to a piece of magic influences how it is used. When that meaning does not fully match its function, the actions taken based on it can lead to unexpected results. This relationship between understanding and outcome forms part of the structure that defines how events unfold. The preventability of Voldemort's death lies within the earlier moments where interpretation might have been adjusted. A willingness to reconsider assumptions, to seek additional information, or to recognize the significance of seemingly small events could have altered the path. These moments exist within the sequence, indicating how the outcome might have been different under other conditions. In this way, the final miscalculation can be understood as the culmination of a pattern that had developed over time. Each decision reinforced a particular understanding, and that understanding guided the actions that followed. When the sequence reached its conclusion, the difference between belief and reality became decisive, shaping the final result. Observing this progression without urgency allows the connections between these elements to become clearer. The alignment between knowledge, interpretation, and action forms a structure that influences how outcomes are determined. Within that structure, the presence of alternative possibilities remains, offering a quieter understanding of how the sequence came to its end. The prophecy concerning Harry Potter and Voldemort existed as a piece of information that did not carry force on its own. It described a potential connection between two individuals, outlining conditions under which one might bring about the end of the other. Its wording allowed for interpretation, and its meaning depended on how it was understood by those who heard it. In this way, the prophecy did not determine events directly, but influenced the decisions that shaped them. When Severus Snape carried part of the prophecy to Voldemort, the information was incomplete. The portion he delivered suggested a threat, but did not provide the full context in which that threat existed. Voldemort's response was guided by this partial understanding, leading him to identify a specific child as the source of the danger described. This identification was not the only possible interpretation, yet it became the one that directed his actions. The decision to act on the prophecy altered the conditions it described. By targeting the Potters, Voldemort initiated a sequence that might not have occurred otherwise. The prophecy, which could have remained a statement without direct consequence, became part of an active process. In this way, the belief in its inevitability contributed to the creation of the circumstances it appeared to predict. The idea that the prophecy could not be avoided shaped how individuals responded to it. This belief reduced the likelihood of exploring alternative interpretations or considering the possibility that the outcome was not fixed. Actions were taken within a framework that assumed a particular direction, and this framework influenced each subsequent decision. There were points where the interpretation of the prophecy might have shifted. A more cautious approach to its meaning, combined with a recognition of its ambiguity, could have altered how it was understood. Instead of focusing on a single outcome, the range of possible meanings might have been considered, reducing the sense that immediate action was required. Within the Order of the Phoenix, the prophecy was known in a more complete form. Even with this broader understanding, the information was not widely shared. The decision to limit its distribution reflected a desire to control its influence, to prevent it from shaping actions in unintended ways. However, this limitation also reduced the number of perspectives that could be applied to its interpretation. The separation between those who knew the prophecy and those who did not created a difference in how events were understood. Individuals acted based on the information available to them, which did not always include the full context. This difference contributed to a pattern where decisions were made within separate frameworks, each shaped by a different level of awareness. The belief in inevitability also influenced how risks were perceived. If an outcome was thought to be certain, the focus shifted from prevention to preparation. This shift altered how individuals approach situations, placing less emphasis on changing the course of events and more on responding to them as they occurred. Within this approach, opportunities for prevention became less visible. The interaction between Voldemort and Harry reflects this pattern. Both were influenced by the prophecy, though in different ways. Voldemort sought to eliminate the threat it described, while Harry became aware of his role within it over time. Their actions, shaped by their respective understandings, contributed to the progression of events that led to their final confrontation. There were moments within this progression where the influence of the prophecy might have been reduced. Recognizing it as a statement of possibility rather than certainty could have allowed for different decisions. This recognition would not have removed the conditions it described, but it might have changed how those conditions were approached. The structure of the prophecy itself allows for this flexibility. Its wording does not enforce a single outcome, but presents a relationship between individuals that depends on their actions. The difference between interpreting this relationship as fixed or as variable shapes how it influences events. When seen as fixed, it narrows the range of responses. When seen as variable, it opens space for alternative paths. The pattern that emerges from this sequence reflects the interaction between belief and action. The belief that the prophecy could not be avoided guided decisions that made its outcome more likely. This relationship between perception and reality created a cycle where each action reinforced the original interpretation. By examining these events slowly, the role of interpretation becomes more apparent. The meaning assigned to the prophecy influenced how it was used, shaping the decisions that followed. Where that meaning was limited, the actions based on it were also limited, reducing the possibility of different outcomes. The preventability of the deaths connected to this sequence lies within the earlier moments where interpretation might have shifted. A broader understanding of the prophecy, combined with a willingness to question its inevitability, could have altered the direction of events. These moments exist within the structure, indicating how the outcome might have been different under other conditions. There were also considerations related to communication. Sharing the full content of the prophecy more widely might have introduced additional perspectives, influencing how it was understood. This approach would have required trust and coordination, balancing the risk of exposure with the potential for greater clarity. The presence of ambiguity within the prophecy itself suggests that it was not intended to function as a fixed guide. Its purpose may have been to describe a potential connection rather than to define a specific outcome. Recognizing this distinction could have changed how it was integrated into decision-making, reducing the weight placed on a single interpretation. In this way, the misinterpretation of the prophecy can be understood as part of a broader pattern where belief shapes action. The assumption of inevitability influenced how individuals responded, guiding decisions that aligned with that assumption. Within this pattern, the difference between what was believed and what was possible becomes central. Observing this progression without urgency allows the connections between these elements to become clearer. The interaction between interpretation, communication, and action forms a structure that influences how events unfold. Within that structure, the presence of alternative possibilities remains, offering a quieter understanding of how the sequence developed. The structure of the wizarding world is shaped by institutions that are intended to provide order, guidance, and protection. These institutions include the Ministry of Magic, Hogwarts, and smaller networks that operate within and alongside them. Each is designed with a specific purpose, and each relies on systems that distribute information, assign responsibility, and respond to changing conditions. When functioning together, they create a framework that supports stability. When that coordination is incomplete, gaps begin to form within the structure. The Ministry of Magic holds a central role within this framework. It establishes regulations, manages communication across regions, and directs responses to emerging threats. Its effectiveness depends on the flow of accurate information and the ability to act upon it in a timely manner. During periods of stability, this process operates with consistency. During periods of change, the same process can introduce delays, as verification and approval are required before action is taken. These delays become significant when the conditions they respond to are evolving quickly. A report that arrives after an event has already progressed cannot influence the earlier stages of that event. In this way, the timing of information becomes as important as its content. When timing and content do not align, the response reflects only part of the situation, leaving other aspects unaddressed. Hogwarts functions within a different structure, one centered on education and the management of a contained environment. Its systems are designed to maintain safety within the school, relying on boundaries that separate it from external influences. These boundaries are effective when the conditions outside remain distant. When those conditions begin to move closer, the boundaries require adjustment to remain effective. The interaction between Hogwarts and the Ministry illustrates how coordination between institutions influences outcomes. Information that passes between them shapes how each responds to the same set of conditions. When this exchange is limited or delayed, their responses may not align. One may act based on earlier information, while the other responds to more recent developments. This difference creates a gap where actions do not fully support one another. Within the Order of the Phoenix, a separate structure exists that operates with a different set of principles. Its members share information selectively, focusing on what is necessary for specific actions. This approach reduces exposure, but it also limits the distribution of knowledge. Those outside the immediate circle of communication act without access to the full context, influencing how they interpret events and make decisions. The presence of multiple structures, each with its own methods of communication and response, creates a layered system. This layering can provide strength, as different perspectives contribute to understanding. It can also introduce complexity, as the alignment between these perspectives is not always consistent. When alignment is incomplete, the system does not fail entirely, but functions in a way that leaves certain areas unsupported. There are moments where this lack of alignment becomes more visible. An individual may act based on information that is accurate within one structure but incomplete within another. A response may be delayed because it must pass through multiple levels before reaching those who can act upon it. These moments, while often brief, influence the sequence of events that follows. The distribution of responsibility within these institutions also shapes how situations are managed. Roles are defined, and actions are expected to follow those definitions. When conditions fall outside of what those roles anticipate, the response can become uncertain. Time is required to determine how to proceed, and during that time, events continue to develop. There are earlier points where the structure might have been adjusted to reduce these gaps, increasing the speed and openness of communication between institutions, could have allowed for a more unified understanding of conditions. Expanding the distribution of knowledge within each structure might have enabled more individuals to recognize emerging threats and respond to them. The challenge within these adjustments lies in balancing openness with control. Sharing information more widely increases awareness, but it also introduces the possibility of misuse or exposure. Maintaining control over information reduces this risk, but limits the range of responses available. The choices made within this balance influence how effectively the system can adapt to change. The infiltration of the ministry during the later stages of the conflict reflects a point where the structure itself was altered from within. The systems that were intended to provide stability began to operate under different guidance, changing how information was managed and how decisions were made. This shift did not occur all at once, but developed gradually, making it more difficult to recognize in its early stages. Within Hogwarts, the changes in leadership and control also influenced the structure. The presence of individuals aligned with Voldemort altered how the school functioned, affecting both its internal systems and its connection to the broader world. These changes created conditions where the usual expectations of safety no longer applied, even though the outward structure remained. The pattern that emerges from these events reflects the interaction between design and adaptation. Institutions are designed to function under certain conditions, and when those conditions change, the design must adapt. If adaptation does not occur at the same pace as the change, gaps form within the system. These gaps do not always lead to immediate failure, but they create spaces where outcomes are influenced by incomplete alignment. Deaths that occur within this pattern are often connected to these gaps. They arise in moments where the system nearly supports the individuals within it, but does not fully align with the conditions they face. The difference between what was intended and what occurred is defined by these moments, where small variations in communication, timing, or responsibility could have altered the result. By examining these structures slowly, the presence of these gaps becomes more visible. They are not always apparent within the flow of events, but they exist within the connections between institutions and the individuals who operate within them. Observing these connections reveals how closely outcomes are tied to the way the system functions as a whole. The preventability of these outcomes lies within the earlier points where alignment might have been strengthened. Adjustments in communication, shifts in responsibility, and greater awareness of changing conditions all represent ways in which the system could have responded differently. These possibilities remain part of the structure, indicating how the sequence might have unfolded under different circumstances. In this way, institutional failures can be understood not as isolated events, but as part of a broader pattern where the interaction between design and change shapes how outcomes are formed. The presence of this pattern provides a quieter understanding of how preventable losses emerge, connected to the structure that surrounds them rather than to any single moment within it. Secrecy within the wizarding world often appears as a form of protection. Information is held back to reduce risk, to prevent it from reaching those who might misuse it, and to allow certain actions to proceed without interference. This approach creates a controlled flow of knowledge, where only selected individuals are aware of specific details. While this control can provide stability in certain situations, it also introduces a pattern where understanding is distributed unevenly. Albus Dumbledore's role within this structure reflects a careful use of secrecy. He gathered information from multiple sources and chose how and when to share it. His decisions were shaped by the belief that certain knowledge carried consequences if revealed too early or too widely. This belief influenced how others understood the situations around them, as they often acted without full awareness of the broader context. Harry Potter's experience illustrates how this distribution of knowledge affected individual action. Information was given to him in stages, each piece connected to a larger structure that remained partially hidden. This method allowed him to act on what he knew, yet it limited his ability to anticipate how different elements might connect. In moments where quick decisions were required, the absence of complete information shaped the direction of those decisions. Within the Order of the Phoenix, secrecy operated in a similar way. Members were informed of tasks relevant to their roles, but not always of the full structure within which those tasks existed. This approach reduced the risk of exposure, particularly in an environment where infiltration was possible. At the same time, it created a pattern where coordination depended on partial understanding, with each individual acting within a limited frame. The result of this pattern can be seen in how events unfolded across different locations. Actions taken in one place were not always fully understood in another, leading to sequences where outcomes were shaped by disconnected pieces of information. These disconnections did not stop the system from functioning, but they influenced how effectively it responded to change. There were moments where secrecy nearly achieved its intended purpose. Plans were protected, and certain threats were managed without detection. Yet within these moments, the same structure that provided protection also limited the ability to adapt. When conditions shifted unexpectedly, the lack of shared knowledge reduced the number of possible responses. The handling of objects connected to Voldemort's past provides an example of this pattern. The search for these objects involved information that was not widely distributed, with only a few individuals aware of their significance. This limitation preserved the secrecy of the task, but it also meant that others could not assist or adjust their actions based on that knowledge. When unexpected challenges arose, the response remained confined to those who held the information. There were earlier points where the distribution of knowledge might have been expanded. Sharing key details with a broader group could have introduced additional perspectives, increasing the likelihood that connections between events would be recognized. This expansion would have required a shift in how secrecy was viewed, balancing the need for protection with the need for coordination. The presence of infiltration within institutions further complicated this balance. The risk that information might reach unintended recipients made the decision to withhold it appear necessary. However, this same risk influenced how information was shared even among those who were trusted, reinforcing the pattern of limited distribution. Secrecy also affected how individuals perceived their own roles. Without full awareness of the broader structure, actions were often interpreted as isolated tasks rather than as part of a larger sequence. This perception influenced how decisions were made, as the significance of certain actions was not always fully understood at the time. In moments of urgency, the effects of withheld information became more pronounced. Decisions were made quickly, based on what was known in that moment, without access to the full context. These decisions followed a path that was consistent with partial understanding. The difference between this path and one guided by complete information defined how events unfolded. There were instances where individuals came close to recognizing the missing pieces. A pattern might become visible, or a connection might be suggested, yet without confirmation, it remained uncertain. These moments reflect the presence of knowledge that was almost shared, existing at the edge of awareness without becoming fully integrated into action. The pattern that emerges from these sequences reflects the interaction between protection and limitation. Secrecy provides a form of control, yet it also reduces the flexibility of response. Where knowledge is concentrated, action is directed, but where knowledge is shared, action can become more adaptable. The balance between these two approaches shapes how effectively a system can respond to changing conditions. The preventability of outcomes connected to this pattern lies within the earlier moments where knowledge might have been distributed differently. A broader sharing of information could have allowed individuals to act with greater awareness, aligning their decisions with the larger structure. These possibilities remain within the sequence, indicating how the path might have shifted under different conditions. There are also considerations related to timing. The moment at which information is shared influences how it is used. Information given too late cannot alter earlier decisions. The timing of disclosure, therefore, becomes a factor in determining how events unfold. By examining these elements slowly, the role of withheld information becomes more visible. It is not defined by absence alone, but by the way it influences perception and action. Each decision to conceal or reveal knowledge contributes to the structure within which events take place. In this way, secrecy can be understood as part of a broader pattern where the management of knowledge shapes outcomes. The presence of incomplete understanding does not stop events from progressing, but it guides them along paths that reflect that limitation. Within these paths, the difference between what occurred and what might have occurred remains narrow, defined by the moments where knowledge was almost, but not fully, shared. Observing this progression without urgency allows the connections between these elements to become clearer. The interaction between secrecy, communication, and decision-making forms a structure that influences how events unfold. Within that structure, the presence of alternative possibilities remains, offering a quieter understanding of how the sequence developed. The progression of events within the wizarding world often appears to move through large moments, where decisions are made and outcomes follow in a direct line. When observed more slowly, this progression reveals a different structure, one formed by the accumulation of smaller choices that connect over time. These choices are not always recognized as significant when they are made. They exist within ordinary movement, shaped by routine, expectation, and the limited understanding available in each moment. A decision to delay a conversation may seem minor, yet it alters the timing of when information is shared. A hesitation before acting may change the position of an individual by a small distance, placing them within a different set of conditions. The selection of one method over another may introduce variables that were not fully considered. Each of these choices carries a subtle effect, and when combined, they create a pattern that becomes more visible when viewed across a longer sequence. This pattern can be traced through many of the events that have already been considered. Communication that arrives slightly too late, protection that is nearly complete but not fully aligned with conditions, and understanding that remains partial all contribute to a sequence where outcomes are shaped gradually. The difference between what occurred and what might have occurred often rests within these small variations. The accumulation of decisions does not follow a single direction. It moves through multiple paths at once, as different individuals act based on their own perspectives. Each person contributes to the overall structure, adding their choices to those of others. Where these choices align, the sequence appears consistent. Where they diverge, new paths begin to form, creating conditions that were not fully anticipated. There are moments where a sequence appears to be approaching a different outcome. A message is prepared but not sent. A warning is considered but not delivered. Or a detail is noticed but not fully understood. These moments do not stop the progression, but they introduce points where it might have shifted. The presence of these points suggests that the sequence is not fixed, but responsive to the decisions made within it. The role of timing becomes more apparent within this accumulation. Each decision occurs within a specific interval, and the alignment of these intervals influences how events connect. A choice made slightly earlier or later can alter the relationship between actions, changing how they interact with one another. This influence is often not visible in isolation, but becomes clearer when the sequence is viewed as a whole. There are also instances where patterns of behavior repeat. Individuals rely on familiar responses, drawing on past experience to guide present action. These patterns provide consistency, yet they may not fully account for changes in the environment. When conditions shift, reliance on established patterns can lead to decisions that do not align with the new context. This difference contributes to the formation of sequences where outcomes diverge from expectation. The accumulation of small decisions is also shaped by perception. What is noticed, what is overlooked, and what is interpreted as significant all influence how choices are made. Perception is guided by available information, which is often incomplete. This incompleteness creates a condition where decisions are based on a partial view of the situation, affecting how they connect with other actions. There are earlier points where the accumulation might have been directed differently. Greater awareness of how small decisions influence larger outcomes could have led to more careful consideration of certain actions. Expanded communication might have allowed individuals to align their decisions more closely with one another. These adjustments would not have removed uncertainty, but they could have altered the path along which it developed. The structure formed by these accumulated decisions is not immediately visible. It exists beneath the surface of events, connecting moments that appear separate when viewed individually. When these connections are traced, the sequence becomes more defined, revealing how each decision contributed to the next. Within this structure, the concept of preventability takes on a different form. It is not located within a single moment, but within the pattern created by many moments. Each small decision represents a point where the path might have shifted, though it did not. The difference between what occurred and what might have occurred is distributed across these points, rather than concentrated in one place. The pattern also reflects the interaction between intention and outcome. Individuals act with specific goals in mind, yet the results of their actions extend beyond those goals. The connection between intention and outcome is influenced by how actions interact with the environment and with the decisions of others. This interaction creates a sequence where outcomes are shaped by more than the original purpose of each choice. There are instances where the accumulation of decisions leads to a point where change becomes difficult. The sequence has progressed to a stage where the available options are limited, and the outcome begins to take a more defined form. Even at this stage, small variations remain possible, though their influence may be reduced compared to earlier points in the sequence. By examining these elements slowly, the role of continuity becomes clearer. Each decision does not stand alone, but connects to those that came before and those that follow. This continuity creates a flow that carries events forward, shaping how they develop over time. Within this flow, the presence of alternative paths remains, though they may not be fully realized. The preventability of outcomes within this pattern lies in the recognition of these connections. Understanding how small decisions influence the larger sequence allows for a different approach to action, one that considers not only the immediate effect, but also the potential for future interaction. This understanding does not remove uncertainty, but it provides a framework within which it can be managed more effectively. In this way, the accumulation of small decisions forms the underlying structure of the events that have been observed. It reveals how outcomes are not the result of isolated moments, but of continuous progression shaped by many choices. Observing this progression allows the connections between these choices to become more visible, offering a quieter understanding of how the sequence developed. The pattern remains steady, moving beneath the surface of events. It does not draw attention to itself in the moment, yet it defines how those moments connect. Within this pattern, the presence of preventable points is distributed across the sequence, showing how closely the outcome is tied to the decisions that formed it. When the sequence of events is observed without urgency, the structure that connects them begins to settle into view. Each moment, once part of a larger movement, becomes easier to distinguish. The pace slows, and within that stillness, the relationships between decisions, conditions, and outcomes become more apparent. What once appeared as isolated points of action now forms a continuous pattern, shaped by the interaction of many smaller elements. This pattern does not suggest a single cause for any outcome. Instead, it reflects a convergence of factors, each contributing in its own way. A decision made in one place influences conditions in another. Information shared at a particular time alters how it is received. Movement through a space changes how that space responds. These elements do not act independently, they connect, forming a sequence that carries forward without pause. There are moments within this sequence where change appears close. A different choice, a clearer understanding, or a slight shift in timing seems to bring an alternate path within reach. These moments are often brief, passing without full recognition. They exist alongside the events as they unfold, not separate from them, but part of the same structure that defines how those events progress. When viewed together, these moments create a sense of proximity between what occurred and what might have occurred. The distance between them is not always large. It is often defined by small variations that influence how the sequence moves forward. This proximity does not imply certainty. It reflects the presence of possibilities that were available within the conditions at the time. The role of uncertainty remains consistent throughout this pattern. Decisions are made without complete knowledge, and actions are taken within environments that are constantly changing. This uncertainty shapes how individuals respond, guiding them toward choices that appear reasonable within their understanding. The outcomes that follow reflect both the clarity and the limits of that understanding. There is also a quiet continuity within these events. Each part of the sequence leads into the next, carrying forward the influence of what has already occurred. This continuity creates a flow that does not stop to isolate individual moments. Instead, it connects them, allowing the effects of one decision to extend into those that follow. Within this flow, the concept of preventability becomes less fixed. It is not defined by a single point where an outcome could have been avoided, but by a series of points where the direction might have shifted. Each of these points represents an opportunity, though not a certainty. Together, they form a structure where outcomes are shaped gradually, rather than determined all at once. The absence of resolution within this pattern is not a lack, but a reflection of its nature. The sequence does not conclude with a clear division between what was inevitable and what was not. Instead, it remains open to interpretation, allowing the connections between events to be observed without forcing them into a single explanation. By holding these events in place, without moving quickly past them, the details become more visible. The spaces between actions, the timing of decisions, and the alignment of conditions all contribute to the overall structure. These details do not stand apart from the larger events, but are part of how those events are formed. The pattern remains steady when approached in this way. It does not require emphasis or urgency to be understood. It unfolds gradually, revealing how each part relates to the others. Within this unfolding, the presence of alternative possibilities remains, not as a contrast to what occurred, but as part of the same continuous sequence. In this way, the events settle into a form that can be observed without assigning weight to any single moment. The connections between them provide a quieter understanding of how they developed, showing how outcomes are shaped by the interaction of many small elements over time. When the events are placed side by side and allowed to remain still, a different sense of the story begins to take shape. It is not defined by single moments of conflict, but by the quiet space between them, where decisions form and conditions shift without drawing attention. Within that space, there are paths that nearly changed direction, and understandings that came close to being complete. Each of these moments carries a subtle weight, connecting to others in ways that are not always visible at first. The wizarding world, in all its complexity, moves through these connections. Magic offers possibilities, yet it does not remove uncertainty. Actions are taken with intention, yet their outcomes extend beyond what is immediately known. By observing these movements slowly, the pattern beneath them becomes easier to see, not as a fixed design, but as a continuous flow shaped by many small choices. In this quiet perspective, the events settle without urgency. They remain as they are, while also suggesting how closely different outcomes once stood beside them, within reach for only a moment.